Chapter 1. In the Asteria Kingdom, located east of the continent's center. In a small room on the right side of the second floor of the Count Palathio's residence in the southern region. Did you successfully carry out the order? Yes, that is correct. The knight, standing, lowered his head in response to the man sitting on the bed. As you commanded, I rescued the orphans in the small village in the eastern part of the kingdom. No, rather, the orphans in the facility for human experimentation. And did you ensure the orphanage was properly managed? Yes, just as you instructed, I left the orphanage in the hands of a girl named Utia. Did you finish the discussion with the Baron's family managing that village? Yes, as soon as I showed them the documents related to the human experimentation, they obediently accepted all our demands, including the entire castle. With that, the knight, Evan, pulled out a leather pouch from his chest and placed it in front of Aelin's side table. Good. Aelin opened the pouch and smiled with satisfaction as he looked at the gold coins inside. Young master, if I may ask one thing. After a moment of silence, Evan spoke. What is it? You said the reason you attacked the human experimentation facility in Baron Alphonse's territory was to save that girl, Utia, right? As Alon nodded, gesturing for him to continue, Evan spoke further. Indeed, she was extraordinary. I've lived a long time as a mercenary myself. Evan paused as if to gather his thoughts, then continued. But it's hard to understand why such a powerful girl was locked up in that facility. And? Why did you just leave her at the orphanage? Alon remained silent in response to the question, which carried a tone of slight incomprehension. In truth, Evan's question was entirely reasonable. Rescuing a girl like Utia without making use of her in any way was an act that brought no benefit. But that was only from Evan's perspective. The situation looked quite different from Alon's viewpoint. I removed one of the world's destruction flags, and that's enough for now. Utia, her real name was Utia Bludia. In 10 years, she would become one of the 5 great sins, the sin of wrath, and wipe out 2 of the 5 allied kingdoms from the continent, causing hundreds of thousands of casualties. If someone were to ask how Aelin knew what would happen 10 years later, it was because he was a person who had been reincarnated. Moreover, he was aware that this world would be utterly destroyed in 10 years as a dark fantasy RPG game called Psychedelia. Sigh. Alon clutched his throbbing head as he remembered the moment he first regained consciousness 2 months ago and let out a deep sigh. At first, just realizing that this was a fantasy world made me bedridden for 3 days, and then discovering that it was 10 years before the main plot of Psychedelia started made me sick for 10 more. Initially, when Alon thought he had merely reincarnated into a fantasy world, he despaired for about 3 days. However, as he began to adapt to the world, the situation didn't seem so bad. Surprisingly, being a noble was quite manageable. The life of a noble was incredibly comfortable. He could wake up whenever he wanted, sleep whenever he wanted, do whatever he wanted, and eat whenever he felt like it. Although he was the 3rd son of a count and held no real power, he was in a position where he could fully enjoy the pleasures of life without responsibility. That's why at first he was somewhat happy. For someone who had worked 78 hours a week at a low-paying job, the life of a noble was unbelievably luxurious. Of course, not being able to access the internet, the pinnacle of modern civilization, was a severe drawback. Still, the life of a noble was satisfying enough to overlook that, but that only lasted for a while. Aelon's mood darkened rapidly once he realized that this continent was named Ampelon. And even more so when he recalled that the noble family he had reincarnated into was the Count Palathio's family. Ampelon was the name of the continent in Psychedelia, the game he had played during his sparse free time while slaving away at work. And the Count Palathio's family was briefly mentioned in one of the game's quests. Moreover, the despair he felt upon realizing that this was 10 years before the main plot of Psychedelia began was as crushing as the time when his paycheck had been delayed for 3 consecutive months. The world of Psychedelia was one where all living creatures, whether nobles or commoners, would be mercilessly ground to dust in 10 years. Among the most doomed was the Asteria Kingdom, to which the Count Palathio's family belonged. In any game mode, the moment one of the 5 great sins appeared, the kingdom was wiped off the map. In other words, it was destroyed. The kingdom would disappear. The nobility would vanish. Cities would be obliterated. In short, Alon's noble life as the third son of the Count Palacio family would inevitably come to an end in 10 years. Thus, if Alon wished to continue enjoying his peaceful noble life, he would have to eliminate all 5 great sins, who were destined to become human-killing machines in the future. And what he was doing now was part of that plan. Well, that's it. However, there was no way he could explain all this to Evan. It's just that the time hasn't come yet. The time hasn't come? Yes. Anyway, make sure this matter doesn't leak to the outside and continue supporting the orphanage as requested. Oh, and one more thing. Alon pulled out a letter from his chest and handed it over. Deliver this letter to her. This letter? Evan asked curiously, and Alon replied, Soon. Yes. Strictly speaking, it was something important. The letter contained a phrase that always appeared in a mandatory event when encountering the sin of wrath in the game Psychedelia. The suffering of the dark, the enlightenment of the light, a single despair and belonging. This phrase was uttered by a slightly suspicious archbishop NPC from a certain holy country who would accompany the protagonist in an attempt to calm the sin of wrath. However, the moment he spoke, the archbishop would turn into a pile of blood, and the sin of wrath would, with an irritated expression, say, "It's too late," before the battle began. The reason Alon now chose to use this phrase was because the current time was what the sin of wrath referred to as the past during the game. He had seen the phrase repeatedly while playing the game over and over, labeled as a spell that could befriend the bloodline, as stated by the Archbishop NPC. Of course, it's ridiculous to think that reciting one spell would turn you into a friend of those insane creatures who make pacts with Cthulhu and wield power. But considering these are people who worship such beings, it oddly makes sense. It was impossible to predict the thoughts of those whose mind bordered on fanaticism. As Alon watched the mercenary knight bow respectfully and leave the room, he shrugged and thought to himself, now that I've removed the first landmine, it's time for the second. A few days later, here's the letter. Evian, having received Alon's orders, arrived at the orphanage once again and handed the letter to her, unable to hide his unease. It was understandable given that the girl, Utia, standing before him, was strange. Her red eyes, in stark contrast to her white hair, held no emotion whatsoever. No, not even a trace of emotion could be detected. Complete apathy. The girl, who looked as if she regarded every being in the world as mere objects, extended her hand and accepted the letter with the same expression she had when Evan first rescued her from the orphanage. Russell. Utia silently began to open the letter. Evan's expression remained puzzled, unable to comprehend why she had been confined in such a facility. Although he hadn't reached mastery, Evan could manipulate mana, and with that came the ability to sense the energy of others. Moreover, Evan's talent for sensing mana was significantly superior to that of other knights, allowing him to perceive it with far greater accuracy. That's why he could tell. No matter how you look at it, this doesn't make sense. The girl standing before him was far too formidable to have been locked up in such a place. And as Evan pondered this, another question arose in his mind. It was about the third son of the Count Palacio family who had hired him a few months ago at a tavern. During his time as a mercenary, Evan had heard that the third son of the Count Palacio family was treated as a virtual outcast, the typical untalented bastard child of a noble house. Additionally, there were rumors that, due to his timid nature, he was often bullied by his notorious elder brothers, who were known as scoundrels. So how did such a third son of the Count know about the secret human experimentation that the Baron's family was conducting in that hidden facility? I don't understand at all. As Evan was lost in thought, his eyes suddenly widened. The reason was, the expressionless Utia, who had been standing there until a moment ago, now had a broad smile on her lips. No, it was more than just a smile. Her mana is becoming visible to the naked eye, displaying a skill that could only be shown by those who had reached a certain level of mastery. She was doing so effortlessly. And then, the person who sent this letter, was it Sir Alon? As Utia spoke, her vertical pupils, characteristic of the bloodline, similar to a reptile's, gazed directly at Evan. Even with that mere glance, Evan, who had reached the rank of an expert, felt an instinctive warning from his senses, and though he silently gasped in shock, he quickly composed himself and replied, "Yes. Why didn't he call me?" Utia's question. Although the thought crossed his mind that he didn't know, Evan refrained from saying it carelessly. His instincts told him it would be a bad idea. Instead, Evan recalled a casual remark Elon had made and responded. He said the time wasn't right. I see. A short reply, but it was the correct answer, as evidenced by the long curved smile on her lips. Utia Bludia, no. I understand. The first daughter of the bloodline, Utia Bloody Queen, moved her enchanting red lips and said, I understand his will. With a letter containing a secret phrase known only to her master held close, she twisted her lips into a bizarre smile. Chapter 2. 3 months had passed since Alon rescued Utia Bludia, who would become a human extermination machine in 10 years. During those 3 months, Alon faithfully lived each day and managed to locate the second sin that needed saving. About a month later, as you instructed, I rescued the child from the illegal slave market and sent them to the orphanage managed by Utia. Alon, who was in the study on some business, heard the report from Evan. You treated them well, as I said? Yes. There were no fights? Of course. Alon, accustomed to Evan's reports after nearly half a year, nodded as if satisfied. But once again, Evan hesitantly asked a question. But may I ask you something? What is it? Why did you send the child you went to such lengths to find to the orphanage? I hesitate to say this, but the child you rescued this time also has an extraordinary talent. Understanding Evan's meaning immediately, Alon nodded thoughtfully. Not just extraordinary, it's world-ending, level talent. The man Alon had rescued this time from the illegal slave market in the kingdom of Kalian, the central nation of the allied kingdoms, was none other than Deus Macallion, one of the bosses in psychedelia who would become the sin of sloth, one of the 5 great sins in 10 years, and, like the sin of wrath, he would erase several allied kingdoms, including the kingdom of Asteria, from the continent as soon as he appeared, and he did so in the worst possible way. Even as a player, Alon had frowned at the gory depiction, and there were instances in psychedelia-related communities where players would have visceral reactions just from reading about Sloth's portrayal. And for a sloth, he sure holds a grudge. The reason Alon had told Evan to treat Deus well after rescuing him came to mind. Realizing that Evan was still waiting for an answer, Alon casually offered an excuse. It's the same as before, the time hasn't come yet. The time, you say? Watching Evan mull over his excuse, Alon thought to himself, he's curious about a lot. In truth, Alon would have preferred a knight who silently followed orders without asking questions over Evan, who inquired about everything each time he received an order. Unfortunately, he had no choice in the matter, or rather, he had already used that choice on Evan half a year ago. Evan was a character in psychedelia who, while not a main protagonist, would appear several times depending on certain routes as a supporting character. Moreover, he was a top-tier supporting character who, once a certain level of trust was established, would never betray you and would uphold his loyalty until the end. In a fantasy world where betrayal and backstabbing were as common as daily meals, Alon knew how valuable it was to have someone who wouldn't stab him in the back. Fortunately, he had encountered Evan while he was passing through the territory and had hired him as a knight without hesitation. I understand. While Alon was lost in thought, Evan nodded firmly as if he understood everything and asked another question. So, when do you plan to meet the ones you've rescued? I don't particularly plan to. But wouldn't it be better to meet them at least once? Alon was aware. Ideally, it would be beneficial to maintain a close relationship with the 5 great sins, and the best way to build rapport would be through direct interaction. However, despite this awareness, the reason Alon chose not to meet them directly and instead maintained a relationship through sponsorship was due to their personalities, specifically their character flaws. According to what he knew, the personalities of the 5 great sins were dreadful even before they became the 5 great sins. One only needed to watch the flashback scenes that played after defeating the bosses of the 5 great sins in psychedelia to understand. Their personalities were so vile that Satan and Lucifer would clap their hands in approval from the depths of hell. Of course, the process that leads them to become the 5 great sins is even more horrific. Alon thought briefly before continuing. Well, I did save them before their personalities could fully deteriorate, so it shouldn't get that bad. But then again, I did only save them halfway through. In conclusion, the personalities of the five great sins were bound to be twisted in some way, which gave him reason to hesitate, maybe in about 5 years. By then, Grandma Evan would have gathered enough data to accurately assess the average personalities of the sins. When Elon gave this somewhat optimistic answer, Evan nodded, just as the door to the study suddenly burst open. Well, well, if it isn't Elon. At the sound of the familiar voice calling his name, Elon frowned slightly and let out a sigh. He knew the owner of that voice all too well. Why is my illiterate brother in here, Turning to the source of the voice, he saw a man approaching with a sly expression. Or rather, when your elder brother speaks, shouldn't you respond? It was Tonio, the second son of the Palacio Count's family, known as one of the scoundrel brothers of the Count's family. He wore a grin that was unpleasant at first glance, and casually placed his arm on Alon's head as he sat. A blatantly disrespectful act. I just stopped by to look for something. Even as Tonio deliberately pressed down on his head, causing a slight pain, Alon calmly answered as if nothing was wrong, thinking to himself. This wasn't the first time either the eldest or the second son had treated Alon like this. In fact, they had openly bullied him since the moment he had reincarnated. Even before he took over Alon's body, the original Alon must have been subjected to such harassment continuously. However, the reason Alon chose not to react and let it pass despite the annoyance was because his desire to maintain a peaceful, noble life was stronger. If I mess with these bastards, my plan will be ruined from the start. If his opponents were truly on the level of the Count's scoundrel duo, Alon would have loved to crush them thoroughly. But the problem was that their level was not that simple. Dealing with a drug lord and a pimp king is tricky. Alon glanced upward. There, the second son of the Count's family, who ran a drug cartel with the grand name of Avalon in the underworld, gazed down at him with a blatant sneer. Of course, the cartel wasn't a large organization by any means, only known to some extent within the kingdom. But unfortunately, the current Alan was incapable of dealing with a piece of trash who could, with a snap of his fingers, order dozens of assassins from the underworld to eliminate him without leaving a trace. Even if he managed to get rid of him, he would then have to face the eldest son, who was in a power struggle with the second son and ran the prostitution rings instead. Given that the eldest was highly sensitive about the succession issue, he would never let Elon, who had defeated the second son, go unpunished. In other words, Elon knew that once he reacted, there would be no turning back. It seems my elder brother wishes to use the study, so I'll be leaving now. At least you know your place. Alon respectfully bowed to Tonio, whose face was full of scorn, and left the study with Evan to return to his room. Soon Evan handed him Utia's letter. This time I brought it personally. Did you? Since rescuing Utia, Elon had been exchanging letters with her on a monthly basis. The content of the letters usually consisted of simple greetings and updates about each other's daily lives. It had been Elon who suggested they exchange letters in the first place. She might feel closer to a pen pal than if we met in person. Recalling the friends he once felt closer to in online chat rooms than in real life, Elon opened the letter and began to read. The letter contained nothing special. As usual, Utia wrote a brief greeting and shared some stories about a few of the orphans. To summarize a bit, it mentioned that a boy named Haydn was very good at playing war games, and that a girl named Yuna was excellent at hide and seek. Reading through the ordinary stories, Alon pondered what he should write in his reply and decided to faithfully recount what had happened that day. He figured that instead of only writing pleasant things, sharing some of his worries might help them grow closer psychologically. With that in mind, Alon wrote about the events of the day and sent the letter to Utia at the orphanage. It was just an ordinary day. At that time. Utia was observing Deus Macallion, a man with ominous, eerie, violet eyes that seemed void. On the surface, he appeared fine. His limbs were intact, though his body bore numerous signs of abuse. He didn't seem physically hindered, but that was only on the surface. If anyone else saw Deus Macallion, they would be convinced that he was broken. His body might have been intact, but his eyes, which should have shown some emotion, were empty, staring blankly into space. He was like a man whose mind had been shattered by mental magic, expressionless and motionless, staring vacantly at a single spot. He was the very image of a broken man. However, Utia smiled deeply as she looked at him. The traces left by that thing, allowing to take direct revenge, you're truly considerate. More than just smiling, Utia clearly understood the intent behind why he had sent Deus here, and spoke. Black goat. Just a single word, but that single word was enough to elicit a response from Deus, who had been no different from a broken man until just moments ago. What filled his once empty eyes was neither intelligence nor awareness, but pure hatred, anger, and fear. Confirming this, Utia smiled and spoke. Don't you want revenge? At Utia's words, Deus's vacant gaze shifted to her. His eyes were filled with hatred, murderous intent, and curiosity. Noticing this easily, Utia didn't say anything more. She simply scattered a light amount of mana, a mana that he had granted, meant solely to confront the Black Ones. Congratulations, he has chosen you, so you will gain power. She didn't elaborate further on the mana she had released. No, there was no need to. The second one he had chosen possessed a talent so exceptional that it could be explained with a single action. So all you need to do is remain loyal to him. Then you'll get your revenge. Utia smiled as she looked at Deus. And so, as a week passed since Deus arrived at the orphanage, Utia received another letter from Milan as usual. I see. After reading the letter, she smiled. As a year passed since Deus had been placed in the orphanage and Utia and Alon continued to exchange ordinary letters, Alon was starting to feel a headache over not being able to find the third boss to save. That was when a piece of news reached his ears. The scoundrel is dead? The second son of the Palacio Count's family was dead. Chapter 3, in Psychedelia, the Count Palacio's family is portrayed as a textbook example of an evil character in a subquest, serving as nothing more than fodder for the protagonist's experience points before disappearing. In game terms, they're essentially extras. However, the reason Alon had quite a bit of information about the Count Palacio's family was that he had repeatedly dealt with subquests related to them while playing the game. The experience points from the subquests involving the Count's family were quite generous. In short, in the game, these characters were nothing more than extras meant to provide experience points to the protagonist. But that was only true when seeing them through the lens of a game. For Alon, who now found himself in a reality where the game world had become his reality, his feelings about the Count's family were quite different. The game merely described the family as selling drugs and running a prostitution ring under the organization called Avalon. But now Alon had seen the actual, albeit fragmented, reality with his own eyes. Even now he was witnessing it firsthand. Alon subtly shifted his gaze forward. In front of him was the corpse of Tonio, the recently deceased, lying inside a coffin. Cause of death, accidental fall. Right. For a man who was a major player in the kingdom's drug trade, it was an absurdly anticlimactic and empty death. But naturally, Alon knew that Tonio's cause of death was not an accidental fall. In fact, it would be strange if anyone present here didn't know the truth. Privacy setting. Alon turned his gaze to the side. Next to him, bowing his head with a deep smile, was Leo, the eldest son of the Count Palacio's family, who had been locked in a power struggle with Tonio for the position of family head. His smile might split his face. Leo wasn't even trying to hide his grin anymore. His expression was practically unmanaged. Anyone could predict that Tonio's death wasn't due to an accidental fall. Yet, despite everyone knowing this, no one voiced any objections to Leo. Not the knights, not the retainers, not even Aldemar, the current head of the Count Palacio's family, said a word to his eldest son. Well, Aldemar's too far gone from indulging in drugs and women to care whether his sons are tearing each other apart. Not like he's capable of saying anything anymore. Alon let out a small, sarcastic laugh as he watched the Count, who was so devoid of dignity that even during Tonio's funeral, he was surrounded by drugs and women. As expected of a dark fantasy, the state of this family is a complete mess. Of course, Alon had no special intention of doing anything about it. From the beginning, Alin's plan was proceeding smoothly without him having to do much, and the only real problem he faced was the 5 great sins. I need to find the rest quickly. As Alon thought about this, he watched the final stages of the funeral unfold. As the coffin containing Tonio was about to be sealed, a question suddenly crossed Elon's mind. Was Tonio's death supposed to happen like this? When he played the episode involving the Count Palacios family in the game, only Leo appeared, so it wasn't difficult for Elon to predict Tonio's death. However, what made him question Tonio's death now was something Leo had said while being disciplined by the protagonist. Mekin, didn't he mention after suffering for years that he finally killed Tonio and became the undisputed heir? Having played the game multiple times and recalling how ridiculous Leo looked in his final moments, Elon couldn't help but tilt his head in confusion. Still, he quickly shrugged it off. After all, it wasn't something he was deeply concerned about. A few days after Tonio's funeral, the Count Palacios family, which had been in turmoil due to the second son's death, suddenly became remarkably peaceful. The succession battle had ended. Although the Count had a third son, Elon, in addition to Tonio, no one expected the family to descend into chaos again. Everyone knew that unlike Tonio, who had aligned with the underworld and sold drugs to gain power to oppose the eldest son, Elon had no power whatsoever. Privacy settings. Even Leo, who was highly sensitive to the succession issue, showed no concern about Elon and didn't pay him any attention. Instead, Leo seemed more preoccupied with swallowing up the drug trade that Tonio had left behind. Anyway, with peace returning to the Count's family, Elon was reading a letter from Utia. The letters they had exchanged for almost a year now were always the same. Nothing special. The content of the letter mostly revolved around the orphanage. She wrote about how some of the children were growing well, and there were also a few brief mentions of Deus, whom Alan had sent there. They're growing well without any issues. Alan smiled with satisfaction as he read the short line in Utia's letter. When he had sent Deus to the orphanage, he had asked Utia to take special care of him since he was a bit of a difficult child. And she always included a short update on Deus in her letters. Talking to her through letters like this, she really comes off as a kind, innocent girl from the countryside. He briefly considered visiting her, but quickly shook his head and continued reading the letter. As he neared the end of the letter, Elon suddenly spoke. Evan? Yes, what is it? Do orphanages usually receive a lot of donations? Usually. Well, they probably receive some, but not too many, I think. That's what I thought. The reason Elon had asked about donations was because of a donation list written at the end of Utia's letter. Was it 3 months ago or 4 months? Curiously, starting a few months ago, someone else had begun donating to the orphanage that Elon had been supporting. Of course, the letter only mentioned that a merchant named Milano had made a donation, so he didn't know the exact amount, but this month 5 people, including me, donated to the orphanage. Though his expression grew puzzled while reading the letter, Elon quickly dismissed it. Well, the more donations, the better. With that, Elon wrote a reply to Utia, half-heartedly agreeing with her stories, and handed it to Evan. Are you going to deliver it personally again? No, didn't I go there just a few months ago? Privacy settings. 3 months ago, I believe. And what did you say back then? If you're asking about the orphanage, I reported that it was running well. Deus, who I delivered there, also seemed to be much better. Really? Elon nodded with satisfaction at Evan's report. As I thought, even though they're destined to become the 5 great sins, they couldn't have been evil from the beginning. It feels good to see that the kids are growing up well. It must have been their environment that turned them into killers in the first place. Elon was once again struck by how crucial a person's environment is for their growth. And he added, this time there's no need to go in person. Just ask someone from the mercenary guild to deliver it. Understood. Evan nodded and was about to leave when something seemed to dawn on him. And do you remember that thing you mentioned last time? Thing I mentioned? The ancient book. Did you find it? I'm not entirely sure, but I found a lead. Tell me about it. At Elon's command, Evan began to relay the information he had gathered from the Intelligence Guild, piece by piece. And eventually, I've found it. He discovered the location of the third sin. Margot, the estate of a viscount located beside a small village in the eastern part of the Asteria Kingdom, was known for its beautiful glass crafts as its specialty. However, that was only the surface of Margot's reputation. In reality, the true source of wealth for the Margot Viscount's family was drugs. More specifically, a group called Phelan used Margot as a distribution hub, providing the Viscount's family with a hefty income. Phelan, which had been steadily growing its power by using Margot as a distribution point, had now become a massive organization with hundreds of members, each led by over 10 expert-level fighters. Because of this, Rawtun, the leader of Phelan and an expert mercenary like the other executives, believed that Phelan would continue to grow even more. At least that's what he thought until yesterday. Privacy settings. Rawtun looked around with fearful eyes. In front of him were dozens of corpses, drenched in blood, lying on the ground. Please, spare me. Spare me. Please, I beg you. Ah! There were only a few remaining members of the organization left, screaming desperately. Rawdon looked at them with trembling eyes. Normally, he would have felt reassured by the sight of his remaining men, who should have been like a sturdy shield. Even if they were weaker than him, their sheer numbers should have been enough to provide some sense of security. Yet despite this, Rawdon felt nothing but fear as he looked at them. Please. The surviving members of the organization were all holding their swords in reverse grips, pressing the blades against their own necks. No, don't. No. Stop, please stop. I beg you, please. Each of their faces was filled with desperation and pleading. But despite this, their bodies, as if moving naturally, pressed the reverse blades into their own throats. Schlack! The last remaining dozen or so members took their own lives. And then Rawtun's body began to move on its own. No! He gripped his sword in a reverse grip. Please. No matter how hard he tried to resist, his body, once taken over, no longer listened to him and only trembled. In his final moments, Rawton saw it. In the darkness of the hideout, violet eyes staring directly at him. Privacy settings. But the moment he saw them, schlunk! Rawton plunged his sword into his own throat. With that, Deus, who had been shrouded in darkness, silently stepped forward and walked out. Well done. Likewise, Utia, who had been with Deus, naturally followed him outside. Is there any point in killing these people? As if he had been waiting, Deus asked the question as Utia walked out. Unlike a year ago, there was a clear light of reason in his eyes. Are you feeling sympathetic? No, I know these people were grinding up humans to make drugs. Then, I'm just wondering if killing them will help us kill those bastards. In response to Deus's question, Utia smiled and said, Of course, no mind. Her answer was clear. This is just laying the groundwork for his return. With her words, a pattern began to form beneath her feet. Engraved in the magic circle was a giant eye with a crescent moon inside. When he arrives, we wouldn't want his place to be in squalor, would we? I understand. Deus, who had been staring at the pattern beneath her feet, nodded as if he had grasped her intent. He said nothing more. All is as he wills. Muttering those words, which he had repeated countless times, the two finished drawing the magic circle beneath them and disappeared into the darkness, leaving no one behind in Phelan's hideout. Chapter 4. Time passed, and it was now the second year since Alon had rescued Utia and begun exchanging letters with her regularly. I've successfully rescued them again this time. Is that so? Alon received the good news from Evan. Did you send them to the orphanage? Yes, this makes it the fifth one. At Evan's words, Alon nodded. Over the past year, Alon had successfully rescued the 3 sins he originally planned to save. Saving the sin of greed was a bit tricky. The third sin he rescued, who is currently known by the name Ryan Groff, was difficult to find, but rescuing her itself wasn't that challenging. The same went for the other sins. It took a few months to locate each one, but with Alon diligently using his game knowledge to direct Evan, they were all found. As he looked at Evan, who had been running around to rescue the 5 great sins over the past year, Alon spoke. You can take a break now. Is it over? It's over. Privacy settings. That's a relief. Evan let out a sigh of relief and looked at Alon. But, young master, aren't you happy? Of course I'm happy. You don't look like it, though. Really? At Evan's remark, Alon turned to look at the mirror. In it was the face of Alon, a face he had grown accustomed to. Indeed. The man reflected in the mirror had a blank expression. No, on closer inspection, the corners of his mouth were slightly raised, but the change in his expression was so subtle that it would be hard to notice unless one looked closely. Alon tried to force his face into a smile, but stopped when he saw that his face, which was normally quite decent-looking, now looked like that of a strange man. It feels like only my facial muscles didn't fully adapt to this body. Unlike before, when his emotions were clearly displayed, Alon's face now rarely showed any expression. Even if it did, the change was exceedingly subtle. Not that it's a bad thing. Of course, Alon didn't think much of it. The fact that his emotions didn't show wasn't a problem for him, but rather for others who interacted with him. He wasn't particularly bothered by it. Anyway, this concludes everything I needed to do for now. Alon smiled as he thought of the 5 potential sins he had gathered at the orphanage. In truth, Alon hadn't expected things to go so smoothly from the start. The 5 great sins had every reason to become the monsters they were destined to be. No matter how hard Alon tried, it wasn't like he could save them before they encountered any misfortune at all. In other words, Alon's only concern had been that he wouldn't be able to save the 5 great sins until they were already too far gone. But contrary to his worries, all 5 of the sins were growing up normally. Evan, yes. When you visited the orphanage last time, you said there didn't seem to be any problems, right? When I checked, even Ryan and Seolrang, who were in bad shape before arriving at the orphanage, had returned to a relatively normal state. Really? Privacy settings. Yes, when I first rescued Seolrang, she was like a broken doll, doing nothing and just staying still. But at the orphanage, she was getting along well. Similarly, when I first rescued Ryan, she kept her eyes closed as if she didn't want to see anything. But when I saw her last, she was reading a book with interest. At Evan's report, Alon nodded. The content matched what Utia had written in her letters. I didn't expect Utia to do such a good job. Initially, Alon had left Utia at the orphanage not only to keep her at a distance, but also because there was a setting in which she was somewhat attached to the orphanage. However, he hadn't been entirely sure that she would take care of the other children as well, and he had originally planned to send Evan to check on the situation and, if necessary, bring in professional help. But that's not necessary anymore. Alon smiled. Everything had gone even better than he expected, and thanks to Utia's efforts, there was now only one thing left for Alon to do: develop some level of self-defense skills. Of course, as the 3rd son of the Palacio Count's family, if he didn't take any particular action, his life wouldn't be in danger, especially since Evan was by his side. But given that this world was based on a dark fantasy, it was essential to have at least some ability to protect himself. He was considering learning magic. Oh, by the way, have you heard about the blue moon, young master? While he was pondering this, Evan's question brought Alon back to the present. The Blue Moon? Yes, it's a recently famous organization in the eastern regions. From what I've heard, they've been hunting down other organizations. An organization hunting other organizations? Yes. Then they're doing a good thing. Alon responded dully, having fully adapted to the dark fantasy world. If the Blue Moon were massacring civilians, it would be a cause for concern. But if they were hunting other organizations, that was a different story. After all, in this continent, Alon had never seen or heard of any organization that didn't involve death in some way. If they were hunting those who played with human lives, there wasn't much reason to view them negatively. So Alon simply responded as such. The problem is that they're also killing nobles. Evan. Yes, young master? Privacy settings. Starting today, you'll sleep in the room next to mine, Alon said decisively after hearing Evan's follow-up. Considering that this Blue Moon organization wasn't mentioned in the original story, it's likely that they disappear before the main events start. But, come to think of it, Leo's been in a bad mood lately. Could it be because of them? As Alon pondered this, he shrugged and began writing a letter in response to the one he received from Utia yesterday. As usual, Utia's letter contained the same kind of content. Some greetings, a brief update on the current state of those Alon had asked her to take care of, and a list of sponsors. After confirming this, Alon considered mentioning the Blue Moon organization that Evan had just told him about, but decided against it. The Blue Moon might be hunting organizations and nobles, but they weren't targeting orphanages filled with children. As always, Alan finished writing the letter and sent it through the Mercenary Guild. It was a relaxed day, a few weeks later at the orphanage in the eastern region. During a regular meeting that had begun on a weekly basis after activities had officially started, Utia was reading the letter Alon had sent. Is that a letter from him? Let me read it. Me too. Me too. I want to read it. A girl enthusiastically waved her hand, while another girl opposite her quietly raised her own hand as Utia read the letter. Even in the dimly lit hideout, their golden and green eyes sparkled. These were Solrung and Ryan, the future sins of pride and greed, respectively. Here. Really? Can I really see it? You didn't let me see it last time. It's about time I did. Utia smiled as she handed the letter over. Solrung and Ryan, along with Deus, who had been silently watching, all looked at the letter with curiosity. A little while later, is this an instruction sheet? It just looks like an ordinary conversation. They all expressed their confusion as they reread the letter before them. The letter contained nothing but mundane daily conversation. Deus, seeking an explanation, looked at Utia with a questioning expression, and she smiled as she explained. That's how it's supposed to look. He ordered me from the beginning to write it as if it were just a normal conversation. Privacy settings. Then Utia pulled out a slightly worn letter from her chest and showed it to them. The content of the letter was simple. It started with casual greetings and naturally moved on to suggest that they regularly exchanged letters about the orphanage. Solrung and Ryan frowned, puzzled. But Deus, seemingly understanding the true intent behind the letter, spoke. Is it because he doesn't want any secrets to be leaked, so he exchanges letters in this way? Correct. I see. Deus nodded in agreement, then glanced at Solrung and Ryan, who were still focused on the letter. If he's worried about leaks, wouldn't it be better to use magic communication or have us go and report in person regularly? Right. Then why insist on using letters? Because that's his will. Utia smiled as she added, if he's decided to do it this way, we follow. There's no need to question or think about it. At her words, Deus felt a dryness in his mouth. While Utia's emotions were generally calm, whenever she spoke about him, there was a deep, unsettling conviction that even made his skin crawl. Understood. Thus Deus nodded quietly, looking into her red eyes, which now gleamed with the light of a fanatic. With that, Utia collected the letter she had distributed to the members and carefully stored it in her chest, marking the end of the meeting. Solrang, what about the North? You mean the slavers? Yes. At Utia's question, Solrang flashed a bright smile. I took care of them all. And your identity? I wasn't exposed. The clothes Ryan made seemed to be working well. I gave them a quiz saying I'd let them live if they could correctly describe my face, but no one could answer. And then? Privacy settings. I plucked them all, their heads. Her words were excessively brutal for such a cheerful laugh, but Utia calmly turned her gaze to Deus. And the South? Avalon was running rampant, so I cleaned them up, and I found something else to discuss while I was there. What is it? The head of Avalon is the eldest son of the Count's family where he resides, correct? Utia nodded silently at Deus's question. However, it seems the eldest son is trying to poison him. As soon as he said that, Manad, what? The atmosphere froze. Just moments ago, Solrung, who had been smiling brightly, folded her ears back and looked around nervously, while Ryan, who had been quietly observing, fixed her gaze forward. The only one who could look Utia in the eyes was Deus, who had anticipated this reaction. But even he felt a cold sweat running down his back as he sensed the overwhelming killing intent that was far stronger than expected. After a short while, are you certain? There was an instruction sheet. Did you bring it? Yes. Deus pulled out the letter from his chest as if he had been waiting for this moment. Without blinking, Utia read the letter. Once the Count, whose lifespan is nearly over, quietly poison him and dispose of him. After reading that final line, I see. She gripped the instruction sheet tightly. So it's true. With a chilling look in her eyes, she muttered softly, Chapter 5. 2 years had passed since Alon rescued all the 5 great sins, marking the 4th year since he began exchanging letters with Utia. There were now 6 years left until the start of the original story, The Count Palacio was dead. The official cause of death was heart failure. However, anyone within the Count's household or those well-informed would have easily known the real cause of death. It was an overdose of drugs. In a death fitting of a dark fantasy world, the Count Palacio had passed away. However, no one mourned his death. The servants and retainers accepted the news of his death with a sense of calm. This was no surprise, given that the Count Palacio had been completely broken, running his last stretch toward death with rampant drug abuse. It would have been strange not to expect such an outcome. Moreover, his life had been wasted in indulgence, consumed by women and drugs. Even after his death, not a single noble expressed condolences. This also applied to his two remaining sons. The eldest son, Leo, had anticipated this outcome long ago and remained indifferent. Rather than mourning his father's death, Leo seemed more preoccupied with the ongoing conflict with the Blue Moon organization, constantly discussing it with the retainers loyal to him. Elon felt the same. From the beginning, his father had turned a blind eye as the eldest and second sons openly tormented him. Surprisingly, Elon had never spoken to the Count even once since he had taken over this body. Their relationship was one of mutual indifference. Thus, the Count's death passed in silence, without a single tear shed, and quietly came to an end. A week after the Count's death, the Palacio family did not appoint a new head, following their long-standing tradition that no new head would be selected in the same year the previous one died. Yet, nothing really changed. Since the time Alon had taken over this body, the Count Palacio had done nothing, leaving the retainers to manage the family while they lined their pockets. And at this point, Alon, young master, I must say it's truly astonishing. Reaching the second tier in just 2 years without entering the magic tower or having a master. Do you think that's a talent that makes sense? Elon had been learning magic for self-defense, though it's only half-baked. Elon gazed at the 3 small spheres spinning in his palm before letting them dissipate with a light sigh. It's good that I have talent, but still. 2 years ago, Elon had discovered his talent for magic and had been overjoyed. In the world of psychedelia, magic was something that could only be used if one had the necessary talent. Moreover, Elon's talent for magic was quite exceptional. Considering that it typically took about 4 years for a mage to reach the second tier, the fact that he had achieved it in just 2 years without a master was remarkable. While not exactly a heaven-sent prodigy, he was still a rare case of someone who had managed to become powerful through sheer natural talent. Even Elon himself felt that his ability to control mana with precision was far superior to that of others. What he had just done, levitating 3 electric spheres and making them orbit in his palm, was a useless trick, but it was a skill that could only be performed by those who could control their mana with extreme precision. However, the reason Elon referred to his talent as half-baked lay here. His natural mana core was much smaller than average. Not just small, a lot smaller. Although it was possible to expand one's mana core through continuous training, in Elon's case, it was so unnaturally small that he had little hope of significant improvement. Privacy settings. A mana cord is akin to one's physical stature, something one is born with. If it comes down to it, I do have a method, but as Elon licked his lips and continued thinking, Evan asked, "Young master, what do you plan to do now?" "What do you mean?" "Well, next year, the the eldest young master, will become the head of the family, won't he?" Evan, having almost called him a commoner out of habit, quickly corrected himself. Elon understood what he was asking and replied, I'll leave. You're planning to leave the estate?" "Not completely, just to a lower position." "Lower? Do you mean to Rodmill?" At Evan's question, Elon nodded. "That's right, Rodmill. Geographically, it was a village about 4 days' travel south of Palion, the Count Palacio's territory. It was under the Count's control, but was flourishing moderately. I plan to move there." "Why?" Evan asked, unable to understand. Though Evan might not grasp the reasoning, this was the final step in Elon's plan. From the start, his goal had been to rescue the 5 great sins from their misery, change the future, and live out his life comfortably as a noble in a world where the United Kingdoms weren't destroyed. In that regard, Rodmill is an excellent choice. First, there was a mansion there that belonged to the third Count Palacio. Second, the village was in a state of moderate growth, making it unlikely that Leo, who would soon become the Count, would pay much attention to it before his death. Third, it was far enough from the Count's estate, about 4 days' travel, that Alan could remain uninvolved in the hero's story of justice and retribution when the original plot began. In short, as long as Alon moved to Rodmill, his plan would be successfully completed. However, finding it bothersome to explain all this to Evan, he simply gave a brief response. Everything has its time. Young master, you always say that when you don't want to explain. Privacy settings. Alon didn't bother replying to Evan's remark. Instead, since we're on the topic, let's start packing. He began preparing to head to Rodmill. Exactly 1 month later, Leo, the eldest son of the Count Palacios family and a major figure in the underworld as the leader of Avalon, was contemplating something as he watched his younger brother board a carriage with a knight in tow, leaving the estate. What should I do? Whether to kill Alon or not. To be honest, Leo didn't find Alon to be much of a threat. It had been that way since they were children. If the late Tonio had always been a threat, bearing his fangs in his bid for succession, Alon, on the other hand, had always been busy bowing his head, constantly watching others and staying out of trouble. Sure, something had changed a bit in him over the past few years, but his attitude hadn't shifted. Even now, Alon had voluntarily chosen to move to the outskirts to avoid getting on Leo's bad side. In truth, Leo had originally planned to quietly dispose of Alon, having him overdosed on drugs at the same time as their father's death. But since Alon had chosen to leave for Rodmill on his own, there was no reason to go through with it. Alon had willingly stepped aside for Leo and seemed to have no intention of becoming his enemy. There was no longer any reason to kill Alon. Yet, the eldest son was still contemplating. Ironically, there was no particular reason for his hesitation. It wasn't that he feared Alon would move to the outskirts and seize the position of heir. Nor was it that he found Alon's subservience as a family member disgusting. In fact, Leo had never felt any familial affection for Alon, or for the entire Count's family, for that matter. In the end, the reason Leo was debating whether to kill him was simply that Alon annoyed him. A month ago, when Alon had come to him, bowing his head and saying he would go to Rodmill, it had somehow rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was because he had just heard that one of Avalon's branches had failed to meet its targets, leaving him in a foul mood. Whatever the reason, Alon's life now hung in the balance. Alman. Privacy settings, yes. Quietly follow the carriage. In less than a minute, Alon's fate was decided. From Leo's perspective, Alon was someone he could kill on a whim. So with that in mind, he gave the order. But the person who appeared behind him suddenly asked, "Do you mean to kill him?" Leo felt a pang of confusion. 2 years ago, this young man had proven himself useful and had become one of Leo's trusted subordinates after numerous trials. He was not someone who would question an order. When Leo gave a command, he followed it without question, without hesitation. Do you think family means anything to? So, despite frowning slightly, Leo opened his mouth to correct what he assumed was a misunderstanding. But instead of words, what came out of Leo's mouth was blood. He spat up crimson blood, his face contorting in shock as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. Still unable to grasp the situation, Leo looked down. A sword had been thrust into his heart. Betrayal. His eyes began to fill with a burning rage, but the man who had stabbed him replied indifferently. "This isn't betrayal. I was never your loyal subordinate to begin with." What are you saying? "I was merely waiting for you to give the order." With that single sentence, Leo's expression, twisted with anger and confusion, began to turn to one of horror as a single face popped into his mind. The face of Alon, the third son of the Count's family. But even then, Leo couldn't understand. After all, Hayden, had been by his side for over 2 years. He had allowed Hayden to stay by his side without suspicion, even allowing him to guard his back for over a year. In other words, Hayden could have killed him at any time if he wished. Privacy settings. So with his eyes filled with disbelief and confusion, Leo looked at Hayden, who finally offered an explanation. "We don't act without orders. We're merely the sword of that person, moving only as that person wields us. This is our creed, the unbreakable rule taught to us by the Red Moon." But, crack, gah! When someone tries to harm the great moon, our swords will move on their own. Schlick. And that is why you've been allowed to live until now. With that, Leo collapsed to the ground, his face hitting the dirt, but his eyes still burned with rage as he struggled to speak. My men, they won't. Don't worry. The moment you gave that order, Avalon was destined to be wiped off the continent. Hedon, a member of the Blue Moon Organization and one of Utia's direct subordinates, continued, "It's a pity. The Great Moon gave you a chance." With those final words, Hedon turned and walked away. Leo never understood their meaning and died shortly after. A cold, emotionless death. 3 days after arriving in Rodmill, Alon was called back to the Count Palacio's estate. The reason was that Leo, the eldest son of the Count Palacio's family, had died. And with his inexplicable death, Alon, who had been leisurely toasting bread in a remote corner of the mansion because there were no servants available, was hurriedly called back to the estate. By then, he had already gained a new nickname that people whispered in hushed tones: the hidden power of the Count's family. Chapter 6. Life in Rodmill brought Alon a great deal of satisfaction. Although it had only been about 3 days, life in Rodmill offered him everything he imagined a typical noble life should be. He could wake up whenever he wanted, sleep whenever he wanted, eat whenever he wanted. Rodmill was a place where Alon could effortlessly live out what he believed were the 3 activities that brought the greatest happiness when done freely. While the funeral of Leo Palazzo, the eldest son of the Palazzo family, was taking place, Alon let out a silent sigh as he looked ahead. Leo lay pale and lifeless, just like Tonio and the late Palazzo Count before him. Alon couldn't help but show a somewhat baffled expression. I have no idea where to even start with this mess. The reason for Alon's confusion was that Leo's death didn't align with how he had envisioned it. Everything seemed to be twisted. Leo's death was supposed to happen 6 years from now. He shifted his gaze to Leo's body, scanning it thoroughly. The wounds were hidden by the ceremonial clothing, but a moonflower. Privacy settings. As per the kingdom's tradition, significant scars or mortal wounds were marked with a blue flower known as a moonflower, which was native to the kingdom. One of these moonflowers was placed over Leo's chest, killed by a sword piercing the heart. While contemplating Leo's cause of death, Alon couldn't help but wonder who had committed such an act. There are plenty of suspects, if I think about it. He knew that Leo had been causing trouble in the underworld, doing all sorts of reckless things. It wasn't surprising that something like this could have happened to him. After all, Leo had likely killed over 1,000 people, directly or indirectly. Despite this, Alon kept questioning the situation because he knew Leo's future. Who could it be? Who killed Leo? With these thoughts, Alon looked around. Quite a few people had gathered for Leo's funeral. Servants, retainers, and knights of the Palacio household were present. He had heard that some nobles had visited to pay their respects, but by the time Alon returned, they had already left. In other words, the only people attending the funeral were those who worked for the Palazzo family. They were all trying their best to avoid Alon's gaze. A servant who used to make casual jokes about how Alon would have died on the streets if he'd been born a commoner was now sweating profusely and bowing his head. A knight who had previously picked fights with Alon every time he stepped out of the mansion now deliberately averted his gaze to avoid looking at him. Even so, Alon noticed something more subtle in their reactions that caught his attention. Whenever Alon's gaze landed on a servant, they would tremble slightly, their hands shaking. Earlier, when Alon's eyes met a knight's and he gave a slight shrug, just as he usually did, the knight fumbled and dropped his ceremonial sword, causing an awkward scene in the middle of the funeral. These behaviors made it clear how the servants currently perceived Alon. They're not just suspicious. They're almost certain it was mine. 2 hours later. Young master. Yes? Privacy settings. It's beyond what I imagined. How bad is it? At this point, you've become the hidden power of the Palazzo family. Someone capable of wiping out Avalon in a single day. Alon realized that he had unknowingly become the rumored mastermind holding immense power within the Palazzo family. I was just toasting some bread. Alon's quiet lament as he recalled his time in Rodmill, where he had been making a simple piece of toast while such rumors about him spread through the Palazzo household. In the time it took you to make that toast, you've become the hidden mastermind controlling sword masters. I'm not in the mood for jokes. I'm not joking, young master. That's truly the rumor going around. How did such a rumor even spread? Elon frowned, utterly baffled by the situation. In response, Evan began explaining the information he had gathered from the guild. A short while later, in summary, a day after Leo's death, Avalon, the organization he controlled, disappeared from the underworld without a trace? Yes. And people think I'm the one responsible. Exactly. Why? Because you're the only one who benefits from this situation, young master. When you put it that way, it does make sense. Indeed, it was a situation where Alon Kuaud couldn't avoid suspicion. Leo had been killed shortly after Alon left the mansion for Rodmill, and Avalon, the organization Leo managed, was wiped out soon after. In such a scenario, it was obvious that Alon stood to gain the most. He had a perfect alibi, being away in Rodmill, while securing his position as the heir to the Palazzo family. Moreover, with Avalon's destruction, the ties to the underworld that had clung to the Palazzo family like sticky tar were completely severed. In other words, any influence the underworld might have had to bother Aelin was now entirely eliminated. But are you sure you didn't do it, young master? You were right there with me, buttering the toast. That's true, but everything fell into place so perfectly that I just had to ask. Are you doubting me? Privacy settings. I wouldn't say doubting, but you do sometimes give orders without explaining the reason behind them. Elon fell silent at Evan's words. It was true. Instead of replying, Elon began to think. Are there any groups in the eastern region that could have taken down a major underworld figure like Avalon? The 100 Ghost Night Parade? No, they won't appear for another 6 years. Then the Root organization? No, they're based in the east, so they wouldn't have come all the way here. Elon shook his head. No matter how much he thought about it, he couldn't think of any organization capable of wiping out Avalon in an instant. As he was about to abandon his thoughts, a realization struck him. He recalled something Evan had mentioned before and asked, Evan, yes? Didn't you mention a group before that hunts other organizations? Oh, you mean the Blue Moon? Yeah, them. Could it be them? Evan shook his head at Elon's question. No, the Information Guild also ruled out the Blue Moon. How can they be sure? The Blue Moon always leaves a mark after their work is done. Also, where the Blue Moon has been, there may be pieces of bodies left behind, but never entire bodies. But that wasn't the case this time. They said it was a hellscape. Most of the organization was cut down with blades. So that's why they think I have a sword master working for me? Exactly. Alon nodded at Evan's explanation. It's true that an organization that couldn't survive 6 years into the future wouldn't be able to eliminate Leo and Avalon. But then who could it be? Well, it was a night filled with endless contemplation. Any traces left? In the underground of the Eastern Orphanage, as soon as the usual 4 gathered, the question was asked, and everyone responded in turn. I left nothing behind. Privacy settings. Neither did I. Same here. Just as you instructed, I made sure to leave no traces. Ryan, whose green eyes glimmered faintly, continued to speak. It seems the Information Guild hasn't linked us to what happened at Avalon. And they've identified it as the work of a sword master who created a hellscape. At Deus's words, Utia remained silent for a moment, as if deep in thought, before speaking. Still, just to be sure, keep an eye on the Information Guild's activities. As I've said countless times before, you all understand, right? This must never reach him. Never. Though Utia's red eyes glowed fiercely, everyone nodded in agreement without hesitation. But do we really need to hide it this much? Deus asked, his usual relaxed smile replaced by a slightly uneasy expression as he observed Utia's uncharacteristically tense demeanor. After a brief pause, Utia responded firmly, Of course we need to hide it. And why? In response to Deus's continued questioning, Utia's red eyes flashed as she answered. I told you, didn't I? We are his sword. We must not judge or think for ourselves. We must simply be the sword he wields. But a sword thinking for itself, that's not right, is it? But the eldest son of the Count's family targeted him first, so It doesn't matter. What's wrong is wrong. There was no order. Understand? We only move on his command. If he didn't say anything, we don't act, ever. Deus rubbed the roof of his mouth with his dry tongue as he looked into Utia's eyes. For someone supposedly living in an orphanage, she exuded an aura of dignity and integrity, yet there was also an overwhelming, undeniable power in her presence. But whenever she spoke of him, something changed within her. Her dignified gaze turned into one of eerie fanaticism, and her noble aura transformed into something savage and monstrous. Thus, Deus couldn't understand. So make sure to erase every trace. Don't disappoint him. How someone like her, with the power and ability to overwhelm everyone present with just her presence, could feel such anxiety and apprehension over something as minor as being found out. I understand. Despite his lingering doubts, Deus had no intention of voicing them, so he simply nodded in acknowledgement. As the conversation drew to a close, privacy settings, they've arrived. A man entered as the basement door opened. Even in the dark, lightless basement, his hair shone with a radiant silver hue, as if it had captured the light of the moon itself. Just as the boss said, in the predetermined future, he was to become one of the 5 great sins, the sin of obsession. The remaining forces of Avalon, 286 men. Laidan, his sharp moon-like eyes gleaming, reported, "I cut them all in half and killed them." It had taken only 5 days for the great organization Avalon, which once dominated the eastern region of the Asteria Kingdom, to disappear, leaving only a tattered signboard behind. But I don't think the job is completely finished. What do you mean? I found additional nobles connected to Avalon. As he spoke, Ladan pulled a meticulously folded piece of paper from his chest and placed it on the table in front of him. The Duke of Altia's family is involved. It seems they're quite deeply entangled, with ledgers documenting their dealings. There are about 4 individuals, all of whom appear to be the Duke's children. Given how deeply they're involved, they might start asking questions about this incident. What should we do? After a moment of silence, Utia, who had been pondering his words, spoke. You already know what I'm going to say, don't you? Her red eyes glinted ominously as she murmured. I see. Then I'll take care of it as quietly as possible. Ladan nodded quietly in agreement. Since the funeral of Leo Palacio, Alon had been keeping busy. Aside from investigating Leo's death, which had unfolded differently from the game's plot, there were other matters that demanded his attention, even though he hadn't wanted them. As a result, his days passed by in a whirlwind of activity. About a month after the funeral, he found himself in Estravan, a territory in the southern part of the Asteria Kingdom, rather than at the Palacio estate. The reason was to attend a ball that was held twice a year as a social event. Officially, Alon's presence was to strengthen social ties, but in reality, he had some business to attend to in the territory. However, he did intend to fulfill the official purpose to some extent. With his position as the future count all but assured in the coming year, forging connections with other nobles was crucial both for his social standing and for his own convenience. Privacy settings, or so he thought. Alon glanced around the ballroom. A chandelier shaped like a crescent moon illuminated the room beautifully, while the sons and daughters of nobles, dressed in their finest attire, showcased the distinct elegance of high society. The problem was, none of those nobles could even make eye contact with Alon. Alon watched as a young noblewoman immediately bowed her head when their eyes met, and he sighed, realizing that his goal of strengthening social ties was going to be much harder to achieve than he had anticipated. Chapter 7, Alon had somewhat expected problems like these to arise. In the game, the Palacio family merely appeared as a stepping stone for the protagonist's growth. But in the Kingdom of Asteria, the weight that the name carried was quite significant. Of course, this status didn't necessarily mean that they were held in high honor. Even if, for about 3 generations, they were considered a highly reputable family within the kingdom, the current Count Palacio family was renowned as the most notorious troublemaker among the nobility in the eastern region. To elaborate a bit more, they were known as a noble family that became incredibly bothersome if provoked. However, if there was something Alon overlooked, despite being aware of this issue, this wine has a rather unique taste. Huh? Oh, what? I quite like wine, and this one has a very distinct aroma. I'd love to take a few bottles home. I'll speak to my father and have some brought to you. Pardon? It was that the Palacio family's propensity for trouble far exceeded his imagination. Alon watched the young lady, who shrunk back like a frightened mouse and quickly bowed her head before scurrying away. He wore a hollow expression. Privacy settings. Look at that. He's threatening Lady Malentino to forcefully take their specialty, wine. Is that so? Just listen to him. It's exactly like when the eldest son of Palacio made threats before. And that wine is a limited edition specialty. As Alon pondered what the problem might be, he heard a small voice and thought to himself with a bitter expression, Leo, that damned troublemaker. Feeling despondent, Alon glanced at the place where the young ladies had been gossiping until just a moment ago. Upon noticing his gaze, they quickly lowered their heads and disappeared somewhere. Alon couldn't comprehend the situation at all. Wasn't it just one of those notorious families in the East? Of course, he could guess that there were negative rumors about the family, and he understood why some nobles might avoid them, but he didn't expect it to be this extreme. More accurately, he hadn't known that the Palacio family was so notoriously ill-reputed among the nobility. He hadn't anticipated being treated this way just because of a misunderstanding about him bringing down the family's troublemakers. So, does this mean socializing is out of the question? Just as Alon let out a small sigh, "Hello?" He turned at the voice, only to see a girl in a black dress smiling alluringly at him. Even among the young ladies present at this ball, she stood out for her stunning beauty. Alon greeted her with a return smile. "Hello, Lady Zenonia." "Oh my, do you know me?" "Of course." From Alon's perspective, it was impossible not to know her. This was only natural, as the girl standing before him was the eldest daughter of the Zenonia family, who, like the Palacio family, were known for their notoriety in the Western region. In 6 years, she wouldn't just be the eldest daughter of the Zenonia family. She would become Countess Zenonia herself. Furthermore, she was one of the 3 major villains the protagonist would confront in the future in the Kingdom of Asteria. "You're quite famous, after all." "Famous, you say?" "Indeed." In short, she was someone he'd rather not get involved with. Seeing the momentary subtle emotion flicker in Lady Zenonia's eyes, Alon continued. "Privacy settings. Because you are so beautiful." Noble society was inherently quite complex. Even within Asteria, there were more than a handful of factions. These factions were split into royalists and nobility, both fervently engaged in political struggles. And it wasn't just empty political rhetoric. Since real interests were at stake, politics were a crucial element for the nobles. Of course, Alon hadn't come to the ball to socialize for the sake of politics. Even though it was half-baked, Alon's goal was still to live a peaceful life, and he knew very well that the words peace and politics could never coexist. Nevertheless, the reason he had intended to socialize to some extent was that even minimal connections could be helpful in aristocratic life. Except for this person. Alon looked at Lady Zenonia. The Zenonia family, like the Palacio family, was regarded as a notorious troublemaker in the Western region. Unlike the Palacio family, which stayed out of politics to act without consequences, the Zenonia family leveraged political situations to their advantage. In other words, they were a bit more cunning than the Palacio family, perhaps more like a corporate criminal organization. "Thank you for the compliment. It's the truth." As a result, one might think that socializing with Lady Zenonia wouldn't be a bad idea if Alon wasn't planning to engage in politics. However, that would be a mistake. People tend to congregate with others like themselves. Politicians attract other politicians, and thugs gather around other thugs. So if Alon were to forge a connection with Lady Zenonia in such a situation, if he were willing to dabble in illegal activities like those dead Palacio troublemakers, it might be a valuable connection. But if not, it would be an irreversible mistake. In the worst-case scenario, he might even end up becoming one of Lady Zenonia's pawns. Contrary to external rumors of him belonging to a group with a sword master, Alon was, in reality, just an ordinary noble with nothing to his name. "I'd like to talk more. What do you think?" "I'd love to, but unfortunately, I think I must leave for today." "Is that so, Lady Zenonia's eyes narrowed briefly, exuding a predatory vibe, a look impossible to decipher. However, just for a moment, Privacy settings. The young lady's eyes opened slightly, as if she were surprised by something. Then she nodded as if she understood, a smile appearing on her face. Just as the rumor said. Pardon? It's nothing. I look forward to seeing you again. With those words, she brushed past him. Alon turned around and looked at Lady Zenonia with a puzzled expression. A specialty wine from Malentino, tangerine tea from Pena, crafted metalwork from Valanda, a premium horse from Paldeon. These were the spoils Alon had gathered instead of making friends after he resolved to make a few acquaintances since he was already there. Socializing is a lost cause. Looking at the list of spoils he had obtained instead of acquaintances, Alon let out a helpless chuckle. I knew it. I shouldn't have studied something like noble hobbies. Recalling the wine studies he had undertaken, hoping it might help with socializing, Alon smacked his lips. He then turned around to do what he had originally intended. Just a moment. Another voice called out to Alon. Hello. Turning his head, Alon saw a woman in a splendid red dress adorned with various accessories. It seemed she had paid a lot of attention to her appearance, down to the most minute details. However, despite her meticulous appearance, her face held no particular expression. Yes, hello. Facing her, Alon greeted her while noticing how out of place she seemed in her outfit. She promptly asked him a question. If you have a moment, could we talk? Alon looked at her with a slightly surprised expression. There had only been one person who had initiated a conversation with him at this ball. Is she from the same side as Zenonia? Privacy settings. For a brief moment, he recalled a list of villains from the kingdom of Asteria, and then nodded. Sure. Whatever her intentions might be, she wasn't on the list of villains Alon had in his mind, and more importantly, she had approached him for a conversation. The two of them stepped out onto the terrace to have a light chat. Soon after, may I ask your name, young lady? Forgive my late introduction. I am Roria, the third daughter of the Duke of Altia. Ah, the Altia family. Yes. Alon involuntarily let out a sigh inwardly. The Altia family was a notorious one from the northern part of Asteria, and like Lady Zenonia, it was a family associated with one of the three major villains, the Duke of Altia. Then again, it's unlikely that anyone who approaches me would be normal. I should have asked for her name first. Alon thought, realizing how quickly he had grasped his situation from just attending a single ball. But why don't I remember her? Alon looked at Roria's face. Her elaborate adornment only enhanced her already outstanding beauty. With a face like this, there's no way I wouldn't know her. In Psychedelia, every member of the Altia family was a villain. In other words, if she were a member of the Altia family, Alon, who had played the game multiple times, should at least remember her name, even if he hadn't memorized her face. That's why, after pondering, Alon asked directly, May I be blunt? What is it? Please lend me your strength. Strength? I am about to be assassinated. At those words, Alon realized one truth. In the game, the total number of Altia family members he'd seen was 4. The Duke of Altia, his 2 elder sisters, and 1 younger brother. So for Roria to be the third daughter, in other words, it meant that Roria was already dead 6 years into the future. My sisters? No, they will try to kill me soon. Privacy settings. Summarizing Roria's story, which started as soon as he realized the truth, it was as follows. She was the daughter of the Duke's only concubine, whom he loved more than his legitimate wife. She had survived up until now because of his favor. However, the Duke of Altia was now gravely ill and could pass away any day. In other words, the moment the Duke died, so would Roria. Then why are you asking me for help? With your power, it should be possible. For the first time, her face showed signs of anxiety. I refuse. But even seeing that expression, Alon had no choice but to reject her request. Of course, I'm not asking you to do this for free. If you help me, I will offer you half of the Altia families. I'm afraid I must decline. Roria's expression was urgent as she spoke. However, Alon's response remained unchanged. It wasn't that he didn't feel sympathy for Roria. Had he possessed the strength, her request would have been worth considering, even if he didn't agree outright. Unfortunately, Alon didn't have that kind of power. Most of the rumors surrounding Alon were untrue. He didn't have an assassin who killed Leo of the Palazzo family, nor did he have the strength of a sword master that had taken down Avalon. Therefore, I'll be going now. As Aelon turned around, he saw the despair flickering in Roria's silent eyes. However, Aelon didn't gain any power from seeing that. He was too busy just trying to take care of himself. Thus, as he was about to walk back toward the ballroom, he clicked his tongue and looked back at Roria. Good things will happen. A blessing spoken to lighten his own somber mood. Roria gave no response. Aelon didn't expect one either, as he turned away. I hope we can meet again. It was merely the faint echo of his modern sensibilities that made his heart ache slightly, so he murmured while looking absent-mindedly at the crescent moon-shaped chandelier to offer some comfort. And then, privacy settings. It would be best to report this part to the Red Moon. On the roof of the ballroom where the chandelier hung, an observer, stationed to monitor Aelon and cut off any information about the Avalon incident if necessary, turned to his side and spoke. There's no need. She's not one of the targets. Even if we do nothing, Laudan will handle it. I see. So she's the only one among Altia's children who isn't a target for Laudan. Yes, in any case, we should focus on other matters. As the observer with green eyes shifted his gaze to another location, Deus also turned his eyes in another direction. There he saw a black-clad figure quietly tailing Alan. Is it a tail? Deus silently began to gather his mana to deal with the figure, but then he hesitated. He recalled Utia's order not to act rashly without permission. Let's just watch for now. Deus and Rhine decided to quietly observe the black-clad figure following Alan. Chapter 8. Alan's ostensible reason for coming to the Estrovan territory was to build connections. However, the real reason he endured a journey of over a week to get here was because of a labyrinth located to the south of Estro. Van, is this the place where you said you had some business? Yes. It took us 2 weeks to find this place, but there's nothing here? As Evan slowly scanned the empty forest, he spoke. Alan also looked around. Indeed, the only things around were an unpaved road and forest that seemed to have been neglected for a long time. There were no features that stood out. That's why I had to go through so much trouble for 2 weeks. Alan's face remained expressionless, but he let out a sigh of relief inwardly. After the ball, Alan had spent nearly 20 days in Estrovan, investing his time in finding this labyrinth. I took it too lightly just because it was easy to find in the game. Thinking that, Alan shifted his gaze to a small ravine visible beyond the forest. He began to walk toward the only clue that had allowed him to find the labyrinth. Are you sure this time? Having already wasted 2 trips, Evan grumbled as he followed Alan. Sensing Evan's footsteps behind him, Alan quickly organized his thoughts. The name of the labyrinth is the Whispering Labyrinth. It's a labyrinth accessible around the middle of the game, and the reward for clearing it is the item called Constraint. Once I get that, my business in the labyrinth will be done. Privacy settings. Recalling the characteristics of the labyrinth he had visited hundreds of times in Psychedelia, Alan walked without hesitation. Soon he arrived at a small ravine beyond the forest. This place looks strange no matter how you look at it. Evan spoke as soon as they reached the ravine. Just as he murmured, the ravine was small, but it had an unmistakable sense of wrongness. Despite the sun hanging high in the sky, the interior of the ravine was excessively dark, as if it were repelling the sunlight. This triggered a sense of alarm and caution in Evan. Let's go. Young master? But instead, this phenomenon filled Aelon with joy. The effect in the ravine was identical to the field effect of the Whispering Labyrinth he was searching for. This meant that the Whispering Labyrinth was indeed here, so he stepped into the dark ravine without hesitation. Evan watched along with a shocked expression, but had no choice but to follow him inside. Entering the ravine felt like the presence of the sun a moment ago was a lie. The interior was shrouded in darkness. In the darkness, various stones carved with what seemed to be artificial patterns rather than natural formations could be seen scattered around. Walking past these, Alan soon spotted an entrance submerged in pitch-black darkness. Alan stood staring blankly at the door, which was undoubtedly artificially constructed, covered with various patterns. How did you know this place existed? Because I've been here often. What? Realizing he had made a slip of the tongue, Alan quickly corrected himself. It was a joke. A joke? With that face, it didn't sound like a joke at all. So how did you know about it? I have my ways. For someone with ways, it did take you quite some time to find this place. I didn't expect it to take this long either. As Alon briefly recalled playing psychedelia, Evan asked another question. So, who made this unpleasant place? It was made by a fellow named Patron. The Whispering Labyrinth. Privacy settings. Alon recalled that in some online communities, it was also referred to as Patron's Water Rocket Labyrinth. Patron, you say? Let's go in. Without answering any more of Evan's questions, Alon walked toward the labyrinth entrance, and Evan, looking nervous and cautious, followed him. Soon no one was left at the entrance of the labyrinth. Screesh! Crack! Crackle! Crunch! A hell gargoyle, which would only be defeatable around the mid-story progression of psychedelia, was being slowly crushed to death as if caught in a massive stone press that had fallen from the ceiling. Evan looked on with a pale face. Watching such a powerful monster, which he could never defeat alone, die in such a futile and gruesome way was enough to leave a mark on his normally stoic disposition, honed by years as a mercenary. However, what made Evan's heart pound even more was the realization that the massive stone currently crushing the hell gargoyle hung above their heads as well. How can the young master be so calm in this situation? Evan looked at Alon. Despite the fact that failing to solve even one puzzle in this labyrinth would lead to a brutal death like the gargoyles, Alon's face remained expressionless. He seemed to be waiting for the door to open, completely unfazed by the situation. Seeing Alon like this only intensified Evan's curiosity about him, and usually, no matter how inscrutable a magician might be, 4 years together would reveal at least a little of their true nature. Moreover, Evan had helped Alon with many things over the past 4 years. Sometimes he saved orphans. Sometimes he took down evil organizations. Other times, he helped a slave girl or paid off an old man's debt. If not, he'd deliver messages with no apparent meaning to acquaintances. He dealt with all sorts of tasks, yet despite handling all these tasks, Evan still didn't know Alon. This was because none of the tasks Alon had assigned provided any clues about his true intentions. The closest thing to a common thread was that Alon seemed to take a sustained interest in some of the children he had saved, sending them to orphanages. Apart from that, there was much Evan didn't know about Alon. Privacy settings. For example, how Alon knew about such a place despite never having left the Palacio estate. Or how he understood the workings of this eerie labyrinth and could confidently answer its questions. Nevertheless, despite the suspicions he harbored, Evan had developed a peculiar trust in Alon, which was enough for him to follow Alon into this suspicious place, partly due to the fact that all the tasks Alon had undertaken ultimately led to good outcomes. What exactly is he preparing? But even with this trust, his curiosity wasn't fading. Evan looked at Alon with eyes mixed with admiration and intrigue, as Alon inspected his surroundings with an indifferent expression. I think I'm going to be sick. In truth, Alon was forcibly averting his gaze to avoid watching the gargoyle being crushed horribly. I knew it was gruesome, but not this much. Screesh! Alon confirmed the door opening as soon as the gargoyle's execution concluded and let out a sigh. Even though he wasn't capable of proper combat, the reason he confidently entered the Whispering Labyrinth, accessible only around the mid-game, was because he knew about this labyrinth. Thanks to that, I cleared it easily. This labyrinth consisted of 8 rooms, each requiring him to solve a puzzle before progressing to the next. Knowing all the puzzles in this labyrinth meant he wouldn't need to fight any enemies, and Alon remembered every puzzle precisely. No, from the perspective of a psychedelia player, the puzzles in this labyrinth were unforgettable. This was one of the few labyrinths where one could re-enter repeatedly without collecting the rewards, making it ideal for grinding levels. Naturally, Alon, who had always used this place for mid-game grinding over countless playthroughs, had memorized all the puzzles and reached the end of the labyrinth with ease. Dragging along Evan, who was utterly exhausted despite no combat having taken place, Alon entered a small room at the end of the labyrinth, where he picked up a ring lying on an old table in the center. It was a plain-looking ring, so unremarkable that some might openly express disappointment, sensing no power from it. However, Alon smiled. He was sure the item he held was the constraint he had been looking for. He also didn't mind the ring's lack of a flashy appearance. Huh? Young master, that ring you were holding just... In the first place, this item didn't function as an artifact. It was more like an elixir that would be absorbed into the user's body the moment it was used. Privacy settings. Now that we've got what we need, let's go. As the ring disappeared from Elon's hand, Evan, who had been surprised, saw Elon turning around as if he had finished everything he needed to do. Evan, still looking dumbfounded, quickly followed Elon out of the room. And as soon as they reached the exit, the labyrinth shut down entirely, as if everything had concluded. Elon and Evan, who had escaped safely, found themselves facing something unexpected. Did you foresee this as well? As soon as they exited the labyrinth, they were confronted by human-shaped golems holding weapons, standing in formation. They hadn't been there just moments ago. These golems are the stone piles we saw earlier. Realizing that these golems were the countless stone piles they had passed earlier, Evan, tense, drew his sword. I'll handle this. Huh? Evan responded with a puzzled expression to Elon's words. Before he could even ask a question, the constraint is now in effect. The pronouncement came from Elon's lips. Seated in the carriage heading back to the Altia Duke's estate, Roria let out a deep sigh, her face filled with profound despair as she looked at the estate in the distance. She gave a self-deprecating smile. As I expected, I was a fool. Roria thought of the man she had met at the ball, Elon, the third son of the Palacio family. But that was only his public identity. According to the rumors circulating among the nobility, he had killed his two older brothers, who were major figures in the underworld, and had even wiped out Avalon, which had been almost ruling the eastern region overnight. He was the true mastermind of the Palacio family, hiding his power and waiting for the right time to reveal his claws. No, it's not just rumors. Having met Elon, Roria knew without a doubt that those rumors were true. The emotional restraint he had displayed at the ball could never have come from someone ordinary. It was almost like looking at father. Roria thought of her father, the Duke of Altia, known as the noble one among the aristocracy because he could manipulate both the royalists and the nobility factions within the kingdom at his will, and someone who should never be crossed. Privacy settings. Her father, who never revealed his emotions carelessly and always remained cool-headed in his judgments. The eyes of her father resembled those of Elon, whom she had seen 5 days ago. That's why Roria had clung to Elon, realizing he was her last lifeline, and she had failed. Honestly, she hadn't been surprised by the outcome. The moment she saw Elon's eyes, Roria had realized that he was not someone who would be swayed by petty sympathy or pity. Yet, she still pleaded for sympathy and pity, because she had nothing else to offer. What she did have was just a semblance of power maintained by the Duke's mercy and affection. No matter how hard she tried to grasp something more, her efforts were always thwarted by those who could hardly be called her kin, her contemptible relatives. In other words, she was powerless, and thus unable to seize her last lifeline. Or rather, she was the only one who thought it was a lifeline. There wouldn't be anyone willing to engage in a transaction where the risks were more apparent than the benefits. In truth, it would be a lie to say she didn't know. Even if it was just a semblance of power, she had already been through numerous situations, fighting against her despicable relatives who had everything, trying to secure her position. So even though she hadn't yet reached adulthood, her mind was already well-versed in the world's logic. She understood all too well that every relationship and story carried both gains and losses. Good things will happen. As Roria gazed out of the window at the scenery of the estate, she recalled those seemingly meaningless words Elon had said at the end. About 30 minutes later, when she returned to the mansion, "What did you say?" "Lady Phelan and Lord Kig have passed away." She heard from a maid that 2 of her siblings who had tormented her so much had taken their own lives. Hearing this news, Roria, looking perplexed, went to her room feeling baffled by their deaths. Her detestable family members were more likely to stab each other in the back than commit suicide. In other words, the fact that those 2 had committed suicide made no sense from the beginning. Privacy settings. This is absurd. Certain that some scheme was at play, Roria suddenly remembered the words of that man, the third son of the Palacio family. Good things will happen. Recalling the words of the true mastermind, who had killed all his siblings and ascended to become the heir of the Count's family. She felt a chill run down her spine. Chapter 9. Kalia, the eldest daughter of the Zenonia territory, had just arrived at the estate and reached the study where the Count was. She found herself once again thinking about a man she had recalled numerous times. Alon Palacio, who had recently killed all his brothers in the Count's family and secured the position of heir. Famous indeed. Kalia recalled the look in the man's eyes as he had gazed at her. Eyes that revealed nothing, as if peering into an abyss beyond the northern lands, indifferent to everything. No matter how many times she thought about it, those eyes sent chills down her arms. Through those eyes, Kalia realized something, that he was the same kind as herself. In truth, if that were all, Kalia would have stopped thinking about him once he had rejected her proposal. Rejecting her proposal essentially meant that they could not be allies, which in turn implied that they were now adversaries. Despite this, Kalia's curiosity persisted, all because of something he had said. Famous, he said. The Zenonia family is certainly famous. Even if they didn't involve themselves in politics, the financial and physical power the Zenonia family wielded was strong enough to overturn the current state of the kingdom at least once. However, that renown ultimately belonged to the Count of Zenonia himself, not to the Zenonia family as a whole, and certainly not to Kalia. Yet Alon had spoken of it. Privacy settings. He had referred to her so clearly and distinctly, in a situation where far more nobles had never seen her face. Having only attended balls twice, he had called her famous. Not the Count of Zenonia, but her. Of course, Alon had said this without much thought, recalling her fame as a villain when the original storyline began. But to her, those words held great importance. How intriguing. Kalia turned her gaze toward the Count, seated in the study. The Count was simply processing paperwork in silence. His head was bowed as if she wasn't even there, focused solely on his work. Click, click. As Kalia walked over to the Count, his eyes naturally rose to meet hers. The same red eyes as hers stared back at her. Though he said nothing, the Count's appearance was brimming with a vitality. Snap, at least until Kalia snapped her fingers once. As soon as the snapping sound echoed, the light vanished from the Count's eyes. The eyes that had been so sharp a moment ago turned vacant, like those of an idiot, and his tightly closed mouth drooped open, drool trickling out. The Count was in a state that clearly wasn't normal. Kalia mumbled as she stared at him. How did he know? No one was supposed to know. Kalia's expression was filled with curiosity as she thought of Alon, who had spoken as if he knew the secret she had kept hidden since she turned her father into an imbecile. Or maybe he was just taking a shot in the dark? With such doubts in mind, Kalia left the study where she had been performing her ongoing act for the past 5 years. Kalia, my lady. What's wrong? There's a corpse in your room. At the sudden outburst, Kalia quickly made her way to her room. And there, she saw it. The informant she had placed on Alon 2 weeks ago lay dead, his head twisted around twice, his eyes open wide, unable to find peace even in death. Privacy settings. It seems the seal didn't activate, so it doesn't appear he revealed any secrets. This was the report from one of the knights. The informant didn't leak any secrets, yet they brought his body into my room. Reflecting on this, Kalia let out a sigh. She felt her suspicions turn into a certainty. Looks like he found a big weakness of mine right after we met, she murmured with a smile. Evan grimaced as he looked at the golems glowing bright red in the darkness of the night. Having worked as a mercenary for over 15 years since childhood, his eyes moved busily, trying to locate the golem's weak points. Yet he couldn't hide his anxiety. He was confident in his skills, but precisely because of that, he was even more cautious of the unknown entities before him. He had experienced firsthand just how much danger something unknown could pose. Moreover, he had someone to protect at the moment. Facing unknown enemies whose characteristics he didn't even know was the worst-case scenario. To make matters worse, the number of enemies appeared to be easily over 20. As Evan pondered how to handle the situation, I'll handle this. Huh? He responded absent-mindedly to the sudden voice, watching as Alon, without him realizing it, stepped forward. His expression was as indifferent as it had been when they entered the labyrinth. Evan found Alon incredibly mysterious and intriguing all over again. He was genuinely puzzled at how his master could maintain such an expression even in this situation. At least from Evan's perspective, the current situation was quite a crisis. In front of them were over 20 human-shaped golems that clearly needed to be dealt with, and it was certain that each one of them possessed considerable combat power. Yet, even in such a situation, Alon had stepped forward, saying he would handle them. To speak honestly about his thoughts, Evan didn't believe that Alon could deal with the golems before them. Of course, Evan knew that Alon was no ordinary person and that he had a talent for magic. He had become a respectable magician, reaching the second rank through self-study without a mentor. Privacy settings. However impressive as that might be by general standards, it didn't mean that such accomplishments would be enough for this kind of situation. While it was true that he had reached the second rank through his own efforts at a young age, even a mere golem in front of him would be difficult to handle with just that level of power. As soon as these thoughts crossed his mind, the golems, which had been standing still, as if assessing their targets, suddenly moved and started rushing toward Alon. And then, I enact the constraint. Alon's voice resounded like a declaration. As Alon murmured the incantation, the world seemed to come to a halt. His vision turned black and white, and the movements of the golems charging at him felt as though they were being recorded by a high-speed camera. And then, a fragment inheriting the great will of Nyakula, state the two constraints you wish to impose. A grand voice that seemed to shake the entire space echoed in his mind. It sounded both like a man and a woman, a child and an old person. As he heard it, a brief cold sweat ran down Alon's face. As expected, it's different from the game. The artifact called Constraint that Alon obtained from the Whispering Labyrinth was just as its name suggested. It imposed limitations on the user in exchange for an equivalent reward. Once activated, numerous options would appear before him. A notification window would prompt him to choose what constraints to impose and what rewards to receive. However, reminding him that this was indeed reality, what appeared before him was not a notification window, but a voice that, just by listening to it, made his head spin and his heart race, filling him with an unsettling sense of dread, as if his heart might explode at any moment. Letting out a deep sigh, Alon forcibly steadied his trembling heart and voiced the constraints he had in mind. 1. State your constraint. The use of magic requires the absolute execution of Babylonian hand signs. What do you wish to gain from this? Power that can slightly twist the laws of the world. Granted, privacy settings. And one more, state your constraint. The use of magic requires the limited execution of the great Babylonian incantations. What do you wish to gain from this? The same as before. Following Alon's words, the voice fell silent for a moment. The slow-moving foot of a golem lifted into the air and then returned to the ground. Alon wondered if he had made a mistake. I accept. As if dispelling his concerns, the majestic voice from the heavens spoke words of affirmation. To you who remember the hand signs and mysteries of a forgotten, great God, I offer my gratitude for inheriting the will. The voice conveyed this message to Alon. Alon's expression turned puzzled at this. Although his face remained expressionless outwardly, Alon's eyes were full of questions. Naturally, Alon had no clue about any of that. The reason he chose the Babylonian hand signs and incantations as his constraints was simple. In the game, these two choices provided the highest possible magic attack power in return. Moreover, he had chosen these constraints so often that he had naturally memorized the Babylonian hand signs and incantations. Of course, he wasn't a genius, so he hadn't memorized all the signs and incantations he'd seen in the game, but he didn't feel burdened by it. Alon knew where the Babylonian hand signs and incantations were written. Therefore, while the voice from the heavens puzzled Alon, it was only for a moment. I will always be watching, you who inherit the will. As Alon realized that the black and white world was gradually returning to its original state, he recognized that reality had resumed. He raised his hand to test the constraints while observing the golems charging at him from a distance. At the same time, mana began to flow from Alon's body, coursing through his heart and gathering at his raised fingertips. Privacy settings. The mana gathered at his fingertips was faint. Even though he was drawing on all the mana his body possessed, the orb of lightning, which should have been shining brightly according to the description in the book, only emitted a dim glow, like the last light of a dying old man. However, Elon felt neither disappointment nor surprise. He was acutely aware that this was the limitation of Elon, the third son of the Palacio family. Nonetheless, refraction, the moment he uttered those words, matching his recitation, rebound. The small orb distorted into chaotic lines. Blue light. With a crackling sound, it began to emit a blue light. The small orb transformed into hundreds, thousands of lines, creating a non-linear light source that sparked and crackled. A light source that emitted a blue glow so cold it almost hurt to look at. Simultaneously, Elon formed a hand sign. His thumb covered his middle finger. It was a stance resembling the gesture used to flick one's forehead. However, Elon flipped his hand around, forming a posture reminiscent of the Buddha's Dharma wheel gesture. With that, he looked at the golem that had already reached him and declared the final incantation, linear diffraction. When the blue light momentarily banished the darkness, he snapped his fingers and a flash of light was released. Whoosh! There was no sound. All that could be heard was the faint whooshing noise following the flash. And what could be seen were the golems frozen as if time had stopped after the dazzling light illuminated the ravine. And then, crack, crackle! The dozens of golems collapsed without any resistance, crumbling into piles of stones. Ibn, who had been rushing to fend off the golems attacking Alon, stood there with his mouth agape, stunned. What in the world? Privacy settings, he muttered, disbelief clear in his voice. Chapter 10. After dealing with the golems, were you hiding your power all this time? Evan, who had returned to the area where the carriage was and was preparing for camp, couldn't suppress his curiosity any longer and asked, No, not at all. Then, was that really second-rank magic? Yes. Evan wore a look of disbelief at Elon's response. I see. However, having realized that no matter how much he asked, he wouldn't get more answers from Elon, Evan sighed and nodded, signaling he understood. He then continued his preparations for the camp. Watching Evan, Elon kept his outward expression neutral, though he felt somewhat wronged. After all, Elon himself had no idea why the magic he had just performed turned out the way it did. I knew that using constraints would make me stronger to some extent, but the combat in Psychedelia, the game Elon had played, was turn-based, not real-time. In the game, the hand signs and incantations were used to enhance magic damage by consuming turns. Depending on the magic being used, the appropriate hand signs would strengthen the spell itself. By selecting the correct incantations from hundreds of options within a limited time, the attributes of the spell could be enhanced. Privacy settings. For example, in the magic he used this time, known as Chain Lightning in Psychedelia, he used 4 specific incantations: refraction, rebound, blue light, and linear diffraction. By using these 4 incantations and hand signs, he enhanced the spell Chain Lightning. Additionally, he placed a constraint on himself to always use hand signs and incantations when casting magic, thus further strengthening the spell. In other words, Elon had expected the magic to be more than twice as powerful as usual, but it wasn't supposed to be this strong. In Psychedelia, using a hand sign or incantation consumed 1 turn each. So the spell Elon had used this time would have been prepared over the course of 5 turns in game terms. Even considering that, is it really enough to overkill the golems? As Elon pondered this, he shrugged his shoulders. In truth, regardless of the specifics, the outcome had gone well according to his plans, and having the magic be more powerful than expected was a good thing. In fact, beyond simply being pleased, Elon's mind was now filled with curiosity. I wish I could experiment a bit, if I could. The hand signs and incantations Elon used this time were ones commonly employed in Psychedelia when raising the protagonist as a glass cannon mage, intended for easily handling large-scale enemy encounters with powerful lightning magic. This meant that Elon had at least 10 more incantations and hand signs still intact in his memory that he hadn't used today. Moreover, the reason Elon's curiosity was particularly piqued was due to the noticeable changes in the magic each time he uttered an incantation. In the game, The incantations merely increased damage by 10% whenever the correct type of incantation was chosen. But here, it's different. Perhaps an ordinary magician wouldn't have noticed. But Elon, who had personally performed the magic and possessed a unique talent for mana control, had observed the magic's attributes changing each time an incantation was added. It wasn't just the power increasing. The very nature of the mana itself altered with each incantation. Therefore, I should conduct some experiments once my mana recovers. Elon closed his eyes inside the carriage, feeling good, even if his expression remained neutral. And at that moment, a girl appeared at the place where Elon had used magic, where only the piles of stones remained that could no longer become golems. A girl with eyes gleaming in a deep green. Privacy settings, no, the one who might have been called Rhine of Greed in the future silently passed by the stone heaps that had once been golems and looked at the door Elon had entered earlier. The door was cracked and worn, but the carvings on its frame emphasized that it was man-made, not a natural formation. However, Rhine knew that the carvings on this door's frame weren't meaningless. Born with a great mission and the innate ability to access the ancient library at any time, she could understand what was inscribed on the frame. From the forgotten age of foreign Hus, the script of the Alanef Empire. Recognizing this, Rhine read the words carved into the frame. From Paleon to the friend left alone. Huh? Rhine involuntarily let out a hollow laugh as she read the inscription. She knew that there was only one person who used the name Paleon in ancient texts. The great Paleon, the one who had repelled the invasions of the Black Ones multiple times during the Age of Foreign Gods, and who had defeated the Alakulaka, a being that could make subjects offer their hearts just by looking at it. The noble, revered, great, and glorious emperor. Knowing that Paleon, as written in ancient language, referred to this one person, she couldn't help but chuckle. Simultaneously, it was made by a fellow named Paleon. Rhine recalled Elon's voice. As she gazed at the outer frame of the wall with a blank, somewhat melancholic expression, the image of the great moon silently watching over the frame surfaced in her mind, and a hypothesis began to cloud her thoughts. Negation and affirmation clashed in her mind, and the scales tipped towards denial. However, what next came to mind was the magic Elon had demonstrated after emerging from the labyrinth. His magic hadn't seemed particularly exceptional, but the incantations he muttered were different. The incantations the great moon whispered were things that didn't even exist in the ancient library. Recalling this, the scales that had been tipping now came to rest evenly balanced. Even though I knew that anyone the red moon would follow must be no ordinary person. Her thoughts finally reached the identity of the one leading the blue moon, and the scale within her mind finally tipped to the truth. Privacy settings that the great moon, Paleon's close friend, was someone worthy of both respect and reverence. Realizing this, she felt a chill run down her spine as she looked toward where Elon was, as a distinct light of respect began to shine in her eyes, which had until now moved only by the command of the red moon. You've returned. Rhine turned her gaze slightly at the sense of an approaching presence, and there stood Deus, who had appeared without notice, nodding his head as his eyes gleamed. Yes. Did you gather any information? Rhine recalled how, a week ago, Deus had stopped monitoring Elon and instead followed the black-clad figure as it retreated and asked him. He shook his head. No, I wasn't able to get any information. Why not? Deus began to explain what had happened when he chased after the black-clad figure, responding to Rhine's questioning tone. And then, are you saying that the black-clad figure died while you were pursuing them? Yes. In empty air, their neck twisted around twice, and they died instantly. I didn't sense anything at all. Rhine fell silent for a moment at Deus's words. I think we should report this. I agree. After muttering these words, they exchanged a few more lines before disappearing from the spot. Finally, the only thing that remained there was the lonely moonlight. 2 months had passed since Elon obtained the constraint from the Whispering Labyrinth. Currently, Altea was experiencing a period of great turmoil. There were 3 reasons for this. The first was the sudden death of Kig, the second son of the Duke's family, and Philinin, the second daughter. The second reason was that Duke Altea, who had been suffering from illness and was predicted to have little time left, had finally passed away. The third reason was that Tamalian, the eldest son of the Duke's family, was found dead a day after the Duke's death, alongside his elder sister, Malian, and they had both stabbed each other to death. Due to this chain of events, all the children who could inherit the Duke's title vanished overnight. As a result, Roria became the sole heir to the Duke's family. Privacy settings. Just like Count Palacio had done not long ago, Roria, who never thought she would ever sit in the Duke's study, now found herself quietly swallowing a breath there in just 2 short months. Rumors about Roria had already begun to spread within the Duke's family. However, amusingly, despite the quiet circulation of these rumors, she hadn't suffered any harm. She had a clear alibi. When the second son and daughter died, she had just returned from a ball, and the eldest son and daughter had killed each other. Moreover, she hadn't had any recent meetings with them, and most importantly, the reason she could avoid all suspicion was that, during her absence at the ball, her organization had been completely destroyed. That's right. By the time she returned from the ball, she had lost all her power due to her damned family. Because of this, Roria was not being questioned in any of the procedural investigations, even though rumors were quietly spreading. The work had been executed so cleanly and perfectly. Roria recalled those words once again. Those words, uttered so nonchalantly, had led to events that were anything but indifferent. She was already certain that everything that had happened was due to him. If anyone claimed these events were mere coincidences, they'd have to be considered lacking in intelligence due to how contrived everything seemed. What does he want? Roria recalled her conversation with Olan. Although he had outwardly rejected her request, he had handled everything more decisively than anyone else could have. And even a month after all the heirs of the Duke's family were dead, he had made no contact. Not even after she had absorbed her decapitated organizations with minimal losses. Pure goodwill? Roria smiled at the fleeting thought. It was absurd even for her to entertain such nonsense. After much contemplation, Roria reached one conclusion. Alon had some sort of plan. Of course, Roria didn't know what that plan was, but she had a vague understanding of one thing: privacy settings. That plan requires the Altea Dukedom, someone capable of killing the members of the Duke's family without leaving a trace, and so naturally wanted something he didn't have. Roria believed that what he wanted was most likely the renown of the Altea Dukedom, and what he could do with that renown. Roria closed her mouth tightly. It was only then that she realized just how absurd a pact she had made with the devil. Realizing this, Roria let out a hollow laugh but clenched her fist tightly. She knew that once a pact was made, there was no turning back. She understood too well what would happen if she broke the pact, having witnessed the fate of her 4 predecessors. Therefore, she didn't even consider betrayal. Instead, she decided to focus on the task at hand. I should at least send a thank you. For the first time, a smile appeared on her usually expressionless face, a smile even she was unaware of. A week later, a bottle of wine and a card arrived at the Count's study for Alon. The wine was from Chernons, an imperial territory, produced only 3 bottles a year, and each bottle was worth thousands of gold. Along with it came a card inscribed with words of respect. Alon, looking at the card that came with it, wore a puzzled expression. And 2 months after that, so you're saying Roria, the third of the Altea family, has become the Duke of Altea? Yes. Altea Roria? That is correct. Is there a problem, young master? Alon began to realize that something was amiss. Chapter 11. It had been 4 months since hearing the news that Roria had become the Duke of Altea. Now only 5 years remained until the original story was set to begin. The world, once blanketed in white by winter, was gradually transitioning into spring, a season that brought with it a lethargic drowsiness to all living things. Young master, no, perhaps I should call you Count now. I haven't had the succession ceremony yet. Although Alon hadn't formally held the succession ceremony, he had begun to use the title of Count Palacio for himself, rather than the heir to the Count's family. Even so, you're effectively the Count now, aren't you? It's quite emotional to see you become the Count. Is that so? Alon gave a faint smile, a bitter one at that. It's something I never planned for, actually. Alon's original intention was not to become a count, but to live a leisurely life as a noble, with the title serving only as a means to an end. However, due to the unexpected assassination of Leo, who was supposed to be the count, Alon found himself in this position. My goals have changed, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. For Alon, spending his time in Rodmill dabbling in magic research and baking bread wasn't a bad life. Still, being a count came with its own perks. The title of count allowed him to enjoy the peaceful, noble life he originally envisioned in a more detailed and luxurious manner. Of course, with the increase in the quality of life came added responsibilities. But having dealt with minor tasks as the heir of the count's family over the past 6 months, Alon found his work-life balance to be quite satisfactory. Privacy settings. I never thought being part of a rogue noble family would be so helpful. Typically, nobles are busy due to the territories they manage, but politics play a much larger role in their hectic lives. However, in the case of Count Palacio, since the family had not involved itself in politics, they could lead a leisurely life unless something urgent arose. Furthermore, while the assassins who dealt with Avalon had indeed taken care of them cleanly, they left behind all the money they had accumulated. This meant that unless he indulged in excessive luxury, the wealth they had amassed would be enough to last for 5 years. By the way, have you found any new information? If you're referring to information about the assassins who killed Leo, when Alon nodded, Evan shook his head. It seems even the Information Guild is taking this matter seriously, as they're conducting a meticulous investigation, but nothing has been uncovered yet. I see. At Evan's words, Alon clicked his tongue in slight irritation. He wasn't investigating the assassins to exact revenge on Leo's murderers. The reason he continued the investigation was that the past he knew was gradually diverging from what he remembered. The butterfly effect. I suppose I should call it that. I had anticipated some changes. Alon had already expected that the past would change due to the actions he had taken. After all, he had intervened here and there to prevent the occurrence of troublesome events in the future as well as to secure the 5 sins. Even a small flap of a butterfly's wings can create a storm, and the things he did were on a scale far greater than the flap of a small butterfly's wings. They were enough to create a hurricane. It's only natural that the past would change, though there are some changes I don't fully understand. Aside from the fact that he officially became a count, Alon recently recalled one significant change in the future. Roria, who had become the Duke of Altia 6 months ago, was originally supposed to be dead, yet she not only survived but also became the Duke of Altia. And her influence in the underworld was growing rapidly. Alon wondered which of his interventions had caused this change in the future, where she was supposed to die but instead lived and rose to power. After pondering for the moment, he shrugged, realizing it was pointless to think about it any further. Instead, he shifted his focus back to the assassins who had killed Leo. That's enough. Stop the investigation. Is that really okay? There's still some curiosity that hasn't been satisfied, but if the Information Guild can't uncover anything, then there's no point in continuing. There was another reason why Alon decided to stop the investigation he had been pursuing for nearly a year. In this world, some knowledge is better left unknown. Besides, things seem rather ominous. The Information Guild in this world holds at least a little information on everything, largely because its owner and guildmaster is the leader of the Night's End Darkness. As far as Alon knew, only a few organizations could escape the Information Guild's network. Knowing this, Alon realized that there was nothing to gain from uncovering their identities. After all, the more you dig, the more assassins would come to silence you. Privacy settings. In the end, Alon decided to abandon his search for information. His goal was to prepare for any unforeseen circumstances, but he realized there was no need to bring more danger upon himself by acquiring knowledge that would only increase the threat to his life. Besides, if Leo was attacked by a group that the Information Guild couldn't even identify, then they wouldn't likely target me. Secret organizations usually don't make a move unless their identity is exposed or someone directly interferes with their activities. They were excessively obsessed with maintaining secrecy. Understood. Evan nodded, turning to leave the office. However, as if suddenly remembering something, he returned and handed Alon a letter. It was a letter from Utia. I brought it with me to give you a report as well. Nodding briefly, Alon unfolded the letter and began to read. The letter contained updates on the orphanage's daily life. Recently, whenever he read Utia's letters, Alon felt a warm sensation in his heart without even realizing it. It was no wonder as Utia's letters, which arrived monthly, were filled with the mundane details of life at the orphanage, alongside the activities of the five sins. These letters had a way of warming his heart. Lately, Deus has been performing puppet shows frequently, and Solrang is engrossed in games with friends. Additionally, there were stories about Rhine quietly reading books and making things, while Ladon had taken a liking to landscaping. These tales naturally brought a fatherly smile to his face. Of course, he hadn't personally raised the five sins, nor had he ever met them face to face. But after nearly 5 years of supporting them and watching them grow, he couldn't help but feel this way. I think it's about time to send them out into the world. Alon was considering the idea of releasing the five sins from the orphanage. Evan. Yes, Count. How old is Utia? No, how old are the five sins now? Let's see. Utia should be 19 by now. And the others? The ones you personally brought in should be around that age as well. Ryan is 17 and Ladon is probably 20 now. But why are you asking about their ages all of a sudden? I'm thinking it's time to send them out. Those kids? Well, I suppose it does seem a bit late for them to still be at the orphanage. Unlike the modern world, in this world, 16 was considered the age at which one became an adult and began participating in society. Understanding Alon's reasoning, Evan nodded in agreement. But didn't you gather them for a reason? Well, I did, but that doesn't mean I plan to keep them forever. Privacy setting. The reason Alon had gathered the five sins was to prevent them from awakening as the five sins who would destroy many kingdoms in the future. In other words, once they were sufficiently cared for, there was no longer a reason to keep them confined to the orphanage. Besides, if I place them in the right positions, each of them should be able to secure a place for themselves. Alon recalled the talents that each of the five sins possessed. He remembered the typical boss battle narration that exaggerated the strength of bosses in games. Utia excels in faith, Deus in swordsmanship, Rhine in research. While the exact extent of their talents wasn't clearly defined, Alon was confident they would manage well on their own. As he began to write letters to them, he decided to include a small gift for each as they were about to venture out into the world. Since I was planning to give them these gifts eventually, I might as well do it now. After spending considerable time writing letters to the five, Alon sealed them and handed them to Evan, who then left to deliver the letters. Watching Evan's departing figure, Alon smiled quietly, thinking, if things go well, maybe I'll reap some benefits too. A few weeks later, in the basement of the orphanage in the eastern region, the five who had each received a letter from Alon gathered to read them. The first to speak after reading his letter was Deus. The great moon commands me to head to the Caliburn, the land of nights. To the colony in the desert. Ugh, I hate the desert. I'm to go to the labyrinth city, Lartania. I'm assigned to the pleasure city, Raxus. As they read their letters, each of them mumbled to themselves, Solrang, Reno, and Ladon among them. And then, the holy kingdom of Rosario. Muttering as she read her letter, Utia caught Deus's attention, who spoke with a somewhat puzzled expression. What could be the purpose sending us to these places? Didn't it say in your letter, Deus? Well, the letter did say to become a knight in Caliburn, but I'm not sure why I should become a knight, Deus muttered, still confused by the innocent comment from Solrang. I've told you before, Deus, we don't need to understand. We just need to follow. At Utia's words, Deus nodded. And besides, we'll understand the reason once we get there. The letters clearly state what we need to do first, right? As Utia spoke, they all looked at their letters again. Indeed, the letters not only instructed them on what professions to pursue, but also mentioned that they would continue to receive support along with the location of a gift from the Great Moon. Privacy settings. So with Utia's final words, just remember everyone, don't ever mention the blue moon anywhere unless he speaks of it first. The five sins, who were destined to become the five sins, now members of the blue moon, departed to follow Alon's instructions. 3 months later. Count, did you know? Deus has been knighted in Caliburn. Really? Alon, who was researching the ancient language of Babylonia, first heard the news about Deus from Evan. And another 3 months later. Count. What is it? Deus has established a knight order. A knight order? Yes. Hasn't it only been 2 months since he was knighted? And isn't creating a knight order something only an expert or above can do? That's right. He's brimming with talent. I think so too. The fact that word of his deeds has spread so quickly suggests that things are quite lively in Caliburn. There's even talk that he might become the 5th Master Knight within 10 years. Listening to Evan's words, Alan nodded in admiration. And then, 6 months later, Count? What? Deuce has become one of the 5 Master Knights in Caliburn. Already? Yes. Alan was left in a daze by Evan's words. This all happened within just 1 year of the 5 sins leaving the orphanage. Chapter 12. A year is indeed a long time. It was enough time for Alan to officially undergo the succession ceremony and become the Count of Palazzo, and it also allowed him to steadily become accustomed to the duties that a count must manage. However, 1 year is by no means enough time for an ordinary person with no prior knowledge of swordsmanship to become a Master Knight. Evan, yes? Master Knight, that means sword master, right? Yes, that's correct. Sword master. To Alan, who had read countless fantasy novels, the title seemed rather unimpressive. However, unlike other mass-produced fantasy settings, where simply wielding an aura blade was enough to be considered a swordmaster, Alan knew that the swordmasters of this world operated on a completely different scale. Information about the swordmasters of psychedelia flashed through Alan's mind. In this world, a swordmaster wasn't just someone who could wield an aura blade. A swordmaster was a being who, beyond that, could unlock a unique ability called a derivative, and could leap over castle walls with a single bound. In other words, a swordmaster in this world was more accurately described as a superhuman rather than just a swordsman who wielded an aura-clad blade. So, are you telling me that Deus has become one of those swordmasters? Privacy settings. Well, technically he's just on the verge of becoming one. While it's true that he's been recognized as a Master Knight, according to information from the Guild, he hasn't yet created a derivative. Then he's not really a Master Knight, is he? That might be due to the Northern Barbarians. At Evan's words, Alan immediately understood why Deus was recognized as a Master Knight. War? Yes. Caliburn had been waging war against the Northern Barbarians for over 10 years, and last year they had lost one of their 5 Master Knights in the Northern conflict. Remembering this, Alan nodded. They're trying to quell anxiety while also proclaiming that they're still strong. There are probably a few other reasons as well, but that seems to be the main one. So, Deus isn't quite at the level of a Master Knight yet. No, it's just that he hasn't unlocked his derivative yet, but according to the Information Guild, he's already considered to be at the level of a Master Knight. They say that even Fiola, the 4th sword, and a Master Knight herself was defeated by Deus in a duel. Hearing Evan's words, Alan let out a small laugh and muttered to himself, "How old is the youngest Master Knight?" As far as I know, the youngest was 32 years old. Reinhardt, the 1st sword of Caliburn, held the record, or at least he used to. Was he the youngest? Yes, isn't he quite famous? Alan nodded at Evan's words. While he wasn't particularly interested in fame, he knew that Reinhardt was an extraordinarily powerful individual. He remembered how Reinhardt always appeared during the 3rd main episode of the game to temporarily assist the protagonist as an ally. Didn't he start wielding a sword at the age of 5 with incredible talent? Recalling the typical narration that would accompany Reinhardt's entrance as a companion, Alan let out a laugh. It had taken Reinhardt over 20 years to reach the level of a Master Knight, despite his unbelievable talent and strength. Becoming a Master Knight in just 1 year. Does that even make sense? It's absolutely unbelievable. Even those with talent take 5 years just to awaken mana, 10 years to envelop their swords in it, and decades to create a derivative. Yet Deus cleared the first 2 stages in just 1 year. As Evan spoke, clicking his tongue with a hint of envy, Alan found himself unconsciously rubbing his chin. I knew he had talent, but I never imagined it would be to this extent. Well, it's a good thing. Privacy settings. From Alan's perspective, Deus's success wasn't something to mourn, but to celebrate. The more successful Deus became, the more opportunities Alan would have to benefit from it in the future. Opportunities. I should be able to seize them, right? Alon glanced at the letters sitting on a desk in the corner of his office. The letters were from Utia, who was in the Holy Kingdom of Rosario. The reason Alon had such a conflicted expression was that over the past year, he had only received letters from Utia. It seemed that the five of them were still communicating with each other. Well, I guess it can't be helped since I've never met them in person. But still, I prepared personal gifts for each of them, so not getting even a word of thanks feels a bit too much, doesn't it? Though Alan's expression remained neutral, there was a hint of frustration as he shook his head slowly. In truth, considering his original goal, Alan should have been grateful that the five sins hadn't destroyed any kingdoms. And so, with a slightly bitter expression, Alan thought to himself, as long as they're living well, that's enough for me. In the central district of Caliburn's capital, Kurdam, there is a grand mansion located in the southern area, where only the highest-ranking nobles of the country reside. It was here that Deus Macallion, the leader of the famous Knight Order Eclipse, and the youngest person in the country to be granted the title of Master Knight, lived. Who, in a stately office that wasn't quite to his taste, but one he used nonetheless, Deus let out a quiet sigh, gazing leisurely out the window toward the mansion's garden. Brother! He spotted a young girl with the same deep purple eyes as him, waving at him with a bright smile from the garden. Seeing her, Deus couldn't help but smile back. The girl waved for a while before resuming her walk around the garden, and as Deus watched her, he found himself reminiscing about the past year, about the moment he had met the family he thought was dead and received the gift from the Great Moon. A year ago, Deus Macallion had already joined the Blue Moon and was operating under its guidance. However, unlike Utia, he wasn't blindly devoted to the Great Moon. Although he was aware that the Great Moon had saved his life, that alone wasn't enough to make him pledge his loyalty. Thus, the reason Deus Macallion was affiliated with the Great Moon back then was twofold. First, to receive training from Utia, and second, because the Great Moon had promised him the chance for revenge against the Black Sheep. After all, since losing his family, whom he valued as much as his own life, Deus had been consumed by anger and festering hatred, unable to sleep at night. Therefore, when he first received his mission, Deus wasn't particularly pleased with it. While he understood that his previous tasks under the Blue Moon were meant to deal with dark entities, this new mission seemed entirely out of the blue, privacy settings. But when he arrived in Caliburn and reached the small inn in the southern region, where the letter from the Great Moon mentioned a gift, Deus couldn't believe his eyes. His sister, who should have been killed by the Black Sheep, was there alive and well, working at the inn. Ahem. Deus cleared his throat awkwardly, even though no one else was around. Thinking back, he still felt embarrassed about how, upon seeing his sister at the inn, he had immediately embraced her and burst into tears. After that emotional reunion, Deus learned about everything that had happened to his sister. Silly. She recounted how she had been dragged into a dark place by the Black Sheep, waiting for her turn to be killed, when a bright light suddenly pulled her back outside. She had nearly been sold to a slaver, but was saved by a man named Evan. Then, Count Palacio had provided her with precious medicine and continued to support and protect her until Deus arrived. After hearing all of this, Deus couldn't help but wonder how the Great Moon had known all of these things. He had never mentioned his family to anyone in the Blue Moon, nor did Utia know anything about what had happened to him, except that he had been attacked by the Black Sheep. But before long, Deus stopped pondering this mystery. Instead, he recalled Utia's words, the words she would often say to him. He knows everything. Soon you'll understand why I follow him. At first, he had dismissed those words, but now they were starting to make sense. Remembering them, Deus offered his gratitude to the Great Moon. For someone like him, who had been consumed by vengeance, the survival of his sister, and the fact that his own name had been secretly protecting her, was the greatest gift and an incomparable blessing. No matter what happens, Deus vowed to repay this kindness. Following the Great Moon's orders, he became a knight in Caliburn. Ironically, becoming a knight was easy for him. Aside from his existing abilities, Deus discovered that he had a surprising and exceptional talent for the sword. He knows everything. It was then that Deus realized that Utia's words weren't just blind fanaticism, but the truth. And by the time he became a knight, Deus understood why the Great Moon had sent him here to become a knight. My mission is to create a royal guard. Whether it was because of the battles with the barbarians or not, Caliburn allowed anyone who gained the king's recognition to form a knight order. Moreover, if someone became a master knight, they were permitted to exceed the usual limit on the number of members in their knight order. But this knight order wouldn't be made up of street thugs. Instead, it would be composed of talented swordsmen who had come to Caliburn to become knights. "Commander, it's time." "All right." Privacy setting, Deus stood up, acknowledging the knight who had spoken to him with eyes full of respect. He headed toward the training grounds. The knights, dressed in the black iron armor that symbolized eclipse, were preparing to depart on an expedition to fight the barbarians. Standing on the inspection platform, Deus looked over the assembled knights. He knew that not all of them would return with smiles on their faces. However, for Deus, this wasn't a significant issue. The Knight Order, the royal guard that would serve the Great Moon, needed to be stronger, far stronger than they were now. Deus knew all too well that the Great Moon didn't desire a knight order that would fall to mere northern barbarians. And so, unlike other knight commanders who would encourage and inspire their troops, Deus drew his sword and quietly uttered the motto of Eclipse, "Prove yourself under the moon." With those words, he embarked on the expedition to fight the barbarians, aiming to create the greatest knight order worthy of serving the Great Moon. Chapter 13. There were only 4 years left until the start of the original story. At the same time, it had been just over a year and 1 month since all the members of the Five Sins who had been in the orphanage became independent. What is Solrung up to? Alan, who was looking at the letter from Utia that had arrived today as usual, suddenly grew curious about Solrung. Although Utia's letters always included stories about her and the other members of the Five Sins, there hadn't been a single mention of Solrung since about 2 months after her independence. No way, she didn't die in some distant place, did she? After pondering for a moment, Alan shook his head resolutely. According to Utia's previous letters, Solrung had already arrived in the desert nation. If she had followed the letter's instructions correctly, there was no way she would die in such a manner. The gift Alan had given her would turn her into a formidable Baba Yaga. That too is a gladiator in the colony, where the strong could gain everything. It was even written in the item description. It must be correct, right? Alan, who liked to read through every detail of item descriptions, thanks to the developer's habit of filling them with various bits of lore, recalled the phrase written in the item Solrung would acquire. If the sin of greed had obtained it, they would have fallen and become a sin, but instead she would become a great warrior. I think that was it. Privacy settings. Of course, the effect Alan received when he used that item was merely a 20% increase in critical hit rate, but the grand background story that came with it was why he had told Solrung its location. Furthermore, in case the item description turned out to be something truly insignificant, he also included the location of a hidden treasure. But it had been 9 months since he last heard from her. Maybe I should have just given her the treasure quietly. As Alan considered this, he shook his head briefly. The reason he had sent Solrung to the colony in the first place was because of the narration claiming she had the talent of a warrior. Moreover, since Alan couldn't support her for her entire life, becoming independent was a crucial process. No, it's better if she can make a living on her own. Therefore, considering Deus's absurd talent, Solrung surely hadn't died. But what on earth happened? While Aeolon wore a strange expression, pondering Solrung's whereabouts, in a desert cave deep within the southern region of the desert nation colony, a girl emerged. The girl, Solrung, looked disheveled. Dirt clung to various parts of her body, and her hair had grown so long it almost covered her face. However, unlike her appearance, Solrung's face bore a wide smile. "It's finally over." Stretching with a sense of liberation, she looked at the gloves on her hands. The golden claws adorned on them were a gift bestowed upon her by the Great Moon, the essence of the Golden Mane tribe. How could the Great Moon know where this was? After finishing the trial and emerging, she tilted her head in curiosity while gazing at the gloves. And rightly so, this essence of the Golden Mane tribe was a legendary artifact that had been passed down through her people, the Golden Mane tribe, for generations. It was truly deserving of the title legendary. Hundreds of years ago, this item had empowered the Golden Mane tribe, allowing them to ascend as the rulers of all beastmen and granting them the power to become kings. Of course, most of what she knew came from tales her mother had told her when she was very young. Having matured somewhat since then, Seorong had assumed those old stories were exaggerated to some extent. But now, in this moment, having worn the essence and been pulled into the inner world to undergo all the trials, Seorong realized that not a single part of those fantastical old tales was a lie. Privacy settings. As she lightly drew out her power, her golden eyes began to glow softly within the dark cave. And that wasn't all. Her hair, and even her tail, began to shimmer as if they were radiating light, just like the golden mane tribe of ancient legends that her mother used to tell her about. Smiling at her newfound power, her thoughts drifted once again to the great moon. There were countless questions swirling in her mind, but she soon dismissed them. She knew she wasn't particularly intelligent, and she was well aware that it was beyond her to deduce how the great moon knew all these things. Most importantly, she realized one simple, clear truth. The great moon was her savior, the one who had rescued her from dying as a result of bioexperiments, and at the same time the one to whom she owed a debt for granting her the power to exact revenge on the black dragon who had killed her parents. As blue electricity crackled around her, she thought of the great moon's command, but soon shook her head. Even if she wasn't particularly smart, she knew that becoming a mere gladiator wasn't the true purpose of her benefactor's will. Thus, Seorong's gaze naturally shifted to the gloves that held the power to empower the Golden Mane tribe. It was only then that Seorong finally grasped the Great Moon's intention. To become a famous gladiator, gather the scattered members of the Golden Mane tribe from across the land, and ikihe, she grinned, kill the black dragon with them. Seeing the perfect answer before her, Seorong smiled. Blue sparks flew everywhere in response to her emotions, but she paid them no mind. With a deep smile, she began walking out of the dark cave. The moon hung in the sky where she emerged from the cave, bathing the entire desert in a blue glow. And then, for the sake of that one, muttering the phrase that had become a habitual chant by now, let's begin. The Golden Mane tribe, who had been known as the greatest beastmen and the kings of all beastmen 500 years ago, began their revival under the blue moon. Privacy settings. Starting from about a year ago after returning from the ball, Elon had found a new interest in exploring phrases and had been investing a significant amount of time in it. Unlike in the game where chanting phrases consumed a turn, and each turn increased magical attack power by 10% to 20%, the phrases in this world indeed altered the properties of magic, just as he had predicted. Take, for example, the phrases Elon used several months ago in a place he visited to obtain restrictions. Phrases like refraction, repulsion, blue light, and diffraction line. Refraction strengthened the instability of a completed spell, causing its range to expand. Repulsion distorted the form of the spell, allowing the transferred projectile to shift. In the case of blue light, it amplified spells conducted in parallel, like lightning magic. Lastly, the diffraction line granted a spell penetration or critical properties. Of course, Elon's understanding was based only on the data he had accumulated over the past 6 months, so the accuracy of these interpretations was still uncertain, but it was clear that each phrase endowed a different property. Additionally, he had figured out several unique rules regarding phrases. Using the same phrase repeatedly is prohibited. Using phrases incompatible with the spell is forbidden, and no more than 5 phrases can be used in a single spell. If any of these 3 rules are broken, the spell either fails to manifest or becomes weakened. There seemed to be a few other rules as well, but he hadn't figured those out yet. Although Alan had plenty of time to explore magic, he could only use magic once per day. If only there were a book about phrases. The phrases Elon used were, according to the lore, the forgotten phrases of Babel, considered to be akin to lost relics in this world. The places where Elon had found phrases were limited to those that had phrases inscribed, but they did not explain the rules or phenomena behind them. In other words, he had to discover everything through direct experimentation. But Elon didn't find this bothersome. Elon's talent was enough to make his exploration of phrases enjoyable and to immerse him in the study of magic. Thus, after finishing his conversation with Evan, he came straight to the training hall and, as usual, began casting a spell. Hu! His hand formed the familiar sign of wisdom, the Jiquan Mudra. Simultaneously, the magic gathered to form the spell he had been experimenting with for about 2 months, a second-tier spell called Chain Lightning. Privacy settings, following Elon's thoughts, the arranged mana formed a spherical orb, deliberately leaving out a specific point to create imbalance. The spell completed. With Elon's limited mana, the magic emitted a faint glow. The only improvement from 2 months ago was that the imbalance caused by the lightning spell had become slightly more refined, likely due to his growing familiarity with it. To put it nicely, the spell had become more precise. To put it bluntly, it was still just a useless spell that was only good for its precision. However, by chanting the phrases, even a useless spell could be given a purpose. Fixation. The lightning that had been crackling before him froze in place, as if time itself had stopped. Compression. At his next muttering, the once large sphere shrank into a small bead while remaining frozen in place. Collapse, crack. With the final phrase, the once small bead lost its form as a sphere. What remained was pure lightning, a fragment of mana appearing before Alan like countless irregular dotted lines gathered together. And then, momentary bloom. As Alan muttered the final phrase, releasing the Jiquan mudra he had been holding, a massive tree of thunder materialized before him. Radiating a brilliance more dazzling than the midday sun, the blue tree stood still, flaunting its presence. It was as if lightning had struck and was frozen in place. Alan nodded in satisfaction. The order of the phrases also changes the spell's manifestation. He recalled how, when he had used collapse before fixation in his previous spell, the magic had disappeared without a trace, and he nodded contentedly. Even phrases that don't match the spell can be used if there is a prior phrase that leads into them. Satisfied with the new information he had gained, Elon confirmed that the tree of thunder he had created was gradually fading away. Though it seemed unlikely that he would ever have a use for it, privacy settings. Muttering this, Elon felt a pang of regret as he turned around, his mana hole now completely drained. His body only allowed him to cast magic once a day, and just as he turned around, Elon saw her. There, in the training hall of Count Palatio's estate, stood a young lady he never wanted to get close to. Lady Kalia, the daughter of the Count of Zenonia. Seemingly shocked by the situation, the usually noble and refined Kalia stood with her mouth agape, an expression of genuine surprise. My goodness! Hearing her shocked voice, Elon turned his gaze away, missing his chance to ask why she was there. Origin? Standing next to her, a middle-aged man, his mouth also wide open in shock, was holding an ornate cane as he stared at Alan with a similarly astonished expression. And then, Elon, confused by the two's reactions, came to a sudden realization. He had heard the man mention Origin, a spell that could only be cast by mages who had reached the 7th rank, and then understood one thing. He had somehow become the subject of a massive misunderstanding. Chapter 14. Lady Zenonia. Or rather, Zenonia Kalia, who had effectively been ruling the Zenonia County by making her father a puppet for several years, had come to Count Palatio's estate for 2 main reasons. One reason was to gauge the intentions of Alan, now Count Palatio. Despite holding cards that could cause substantial damage to the current Zenonia County, he hadn't used them. The relationship between Zenonia County and Palatio County wasn't necessarily bad, but she knew that the essence of the Count was similar to her own, a kindred spirit, so to speak. In other words, she easily understood that Alan wasn't the type to wield such powerful cards out of some trivial sentimentality or misplaced compassion. She had come to ascertain his true intentions. The second reason was to assess the power of the organization that Count Palatio was rumored to control. Of course, Kalia knew that just meeting the Count wouldn't reveal the full extent of the shadowy organization he commanded. However, Kalia had a way to glimpse at the fringes of that power. There was the wizard Bianco. He had once proposed a new theory on forgotten era magic within the magic tower, earning academic acclaim, but he was later expelled from the tower due to his excessively inhumane magical experiments. However, despite his expulsion, his rank was still 5th tier. Privacy settings. He was strong enough to obliterate an entire battalion of soldiers by himself. Kalia had brought him along in exchange for assisting with his experiments, forging an alliance with him. She reasoned that if a wizard like Bianco, who specialized in detection magic and was on the cusp of the 5th tier, was present, he could easily assess the caliber of those protecting Count Palacio. While the nature of one's guards didn't reveal everything, observing the level of those guarding the Count could naturally offer insights into the organization's inner workings. At least that was why she had brought Bianco along. In the reception room of Count Palacio's estate, Lady Kalia subtly glanced at Bianco, who still hadn't fully closed his mouth and wore an anxious expression. She was inwardly surprised. As far as she knew, he wasn't someone who would normally show such foolish expressions in front of others. Bianco's face was always arrogant, and he never spoke politely to anyone, not even to her, who supported him. Of course, Kalia understood why Bianco was like this. Even though he was a wizard expelled from the magic tower, the fact that he had reached the pinnacle of the 5th tier lent credibility and justification to his attitude. But now, Bianco's expression was extremely unusual. His face was still marked by shock, just as it had been earlier, and she could even detect flickers of fear, something she had never seen in him before. Why? Kalia felt a mix of curiosity and unease as she looked at Bianco. She had never seen him display such blatant fear. If he's reacting like this, could it really be that the magic we saw earlier was an origin spell? Kalia's thought was fleeting as she quickly refocused on the present situation and met Alon's gaze. His eyes were the same as before. His glance, which seemed to find no value in the current situation, moved slowly and indifferently over Bianco and Kalia. Silence. My apologies, Count Palacio. I've been rude. Kalia was the first to break the silence. Although she was still Lady Zenonia on the surface, she respectfully addressed the Count and apologized for entering the training grounds. Even though she tried to excuse her actions, peering into someone else's training ground was clearly an affront, even if not a serious one. After a moment of silence, Alon spoke. No need to blame yourself. Privacy settings. Thank you. Under normal circumstances, I would ask why you visited the county, but before that, let me clarify one thing. Please go ahead. In response to Kalia's answer, Alon spoke without hesitation. What I used wasn't origin. It seems the wizard you brought along misunderstood. Is that so? Indeed, my magic skills aren't particularly exceptional. If I had to rank them, they would be around the 2nd tier. Naturally, Kalia didn't believe Alon's words. Even though she wasn't well versed in magic, she could easily tell that the magic Alon had displayed was anything but ordinary. She turned her gaze subtly back to Bianco and was even more surprised. His expression was worse than before. However, despite his sour expression, he seemed to have understood the underlying message in Alon's words. It was a warning to keep quiet about what they had witnessed here. It seems I was mistaken, Bianco forced out the words. Kalia was once again startled, hearing him speak in polite language for the first time in 5 years. He usually spoke informally. Yes, you seem quite capable, so you've likely already noticed. But that magic is of no practical use. Now then, since the misunderstanding has been cleared up, what brings you to the county? Without hesitation, Alon moved the conversation forward, prompting Kalia to quickly collect herself and respond. It wasn't anything special. I happened to be in the area for some business and thought of you, so I decided to stop by briefly. Is that so? Yes. After pondering for a moment, Alon spoke. Unfortunately, I'm quite busy and won't be able to chat for long. That's fine, I only stopped by briefly. I just wanted to pay my respects. If you're in need of conversation, it might be a good idea to visit the Duke of Altia. The Duke of Altia, you say? Yes, I think the two of you would get along quite well. If you say so, I'll consider visiting the Duke. Privacy settings. Lady Zenonia smiled as she replied to Alon, who spoke with an indifferent expression. However, her mouth was dry. Why would Lady Zenonia from that notorious family in the West visit you? Watching as Lady Zenonia's carriage gradually disappeared into the distance, Evan asked the question, and Alon answered. How would I know? Is that so? Evan looked puzzled, but Alon genuinely had nothing more to say this time. He couldn't guess why Kalia had come either. It's annoying that I showed her my magic. Alon thought about the wizard from Zenonia who had mistaken his magic for origin. Let's just hope rumors about me using origin don't start spreading. In this world, rumors carried more power than one might think. If a rumor spread that Alon could use Origin, a spell only supreme wizards in this world could cast, it might seem advantageous at first glance, but it would actually be a major headache. In this dark fantasy world, it wasn't hard to find madmen who couldn't resist picking fights with anyone strong. If he had a solid backer, that might be another story. But without one, if strange rumors spread, it would be more than just an annoyance. Dangerously powerful individuals could start picking fights with him for no reason. In fact, Alon could already think of 8 strong people who would come looking for him if they heard he could use Origin, so he wanted to nip any rumors in the bud quickly. Hopefully, she understood. As he recalled the wizard nodding in agreement before sending Lady Zenonia off to clear up any misunderstandings, Alon continued his thoughts with an uncomfortable expression. Why on earth are they interested in me anyway? For Alon, Kalia was not just uninteresting, she was someone he wanted to avoid as much as possible. If they somehow became close, the likelihood of getting involved in the underworld would increase naturally. He did introduce her to the Duke of Altia, though. He knew there was no way Lady Zenonia would actually seek out the Duke. Even so, the reason he introduced her to the Duke of Altia was more about sending a message that he had no interest in associating with her. Don't come looking for me, privacy settings. With that thought, Alon ended his musings about Kalia. Meanwhile, inside the carriage, was the magic Count Palatio used really Origin? Kalia was asking. Unlike his usual immediate responses, Bianco remained silent. Just as Kalia was about to speak again, it wasn't Origin. Bianco finally spoke. It wasn't Origin? Then what was that earlier display? As Kalia questioned him, clearly not understanding, Bianco took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, and began to explain. Origin is the endpoint of all wizards, a canvas of sorts. It is a canvas allowed only to those who have established magic as a truth, where they can draw their own unique laws. Magic that possesses its own unique arrangements and manifestation formulas, painted onto an unchanging canvas. This is what we call Origin. However, he swallowed and continued, Count Palatio's magic was different. In what way? It wasn't drawing on a canvas. To be more precise, his magic was akin to tearing the canvas apart. When Kalia looked at him, clearly not comprehending, Bianco explained further. In other words, he was twisting the truth that should remain unchangeable. Although I only saw it for a fleeting moment, since I was using the observation eye at your request, I saw it clearly. Bianco muttered, fixing lightning that shouldn't stop, twisting the laws to collapse the spell that had been manifested, and yet still managing to manifest it flawlessly. It was an unbelievable miracle, and behind it, he stopped speaking abruptly. The image of Count Palatio from earlier flashed in his mind. At the moment when he displayed that incredible magic, his eyes had revealed a talent that could only be attained upon reaching the 6th tier, even if acquired later in life, a talent that Bianco had only barely glimpsed and after reaching the peak of the 5th tier due to his own latent talent. Eyes that could perceive the world itself. It was an eye. Privacy settings. A pair of jet black eyes with 2 crimson rings encircling the pupils. Those eyes had appeared when the Count used his magic. As soon as the magic disappeared, so too did those eyes, vanishing as if they had never existed. Recalling this, Bianco could not hide the fear that filled his own eyes. If it was what he thought it was, the Count had accessed the power of a forgotten ancient god when he used that magic. But Bianco cut off his own thoughts, even using magic to force himself to stop thinking. Having delved into ancient knowledge, he was well aware of how dangerous it was to try to infer the truth behind such things through further thought. Let me give you one piece of advice. Never make an enemy of him. Do not oppose Count Palatio. What? That's all the advice I can give. Having said that much, Bianco fell silent. Lady Zenonia also kept her silence. At the same time, Kalia naturally recalled Alon's expressionless face and his calm gaze as he had looked at her. Sigh. Without realizing it, she let out a self-deprecating smile. Because through Bianco's words, she had realized something. There was no point in trying to understand Count Palatio's intentions from the start. At the same time, if you're in need of conversation, it might be a good idea to visit the Duke of Altia. The Duke of Altia? Yes, I think the two of you would get along quite well. She had also realized that she had already become nothing more than a pawn on his chessboard. The carriage remained steeped in silence for a long while. And then, about 5 months later, by now quite accustomed to his role and proficiently handling the duties of the Count, Alon realized something. Ah, Count, did you hear about this? Privacy settings. Hear about what? I heard that the Zenonia County and the Duke of Altia have formed an alliance. What? Alon realized that the Kingdom of Asteria was now facing a crisis. Chapter 15. In the Kingdom of Asteria, there are three major clandestine families. One is the Ducal House of Altia in the north. Another is the Count's House of Zenonia in the west. And lastly, the Count's House of Palacio in the east. These three families originally divided the underworld of the Kingdom of Asteria into three parts, forming a massive shadow organization. By the time the original story begins, these families have grown powerful enough to subtly manipulate the kingdom from the shadows. The House of Palacio, however, had long since fallen from power after the assassination of Leo, which led to the complete disintegration of their organization. Thus, only the Ducal House of Altia and the Count's House of Zenonia remain as shadowy forces within the kingdom. At first glance, the alliance between the two doesn't seem to be a major issue. Is that true? Have you ever seen me lie, Count? That's true. Of course, since the agreement was made in the underworld, there might not be any obvious signs on the surface, but it appears that the alliance is genuine. The reason Alon was so alarmed was that he roughly understood the situation of the shadow forces at the beginning of the original story. When the protagonist arrives in the Kingdom of Asteria, the three families possess immense power, but are unable to wield it properly due to their constant checks on each other. However, with the House of Palacio now out of the picture, if the House of Zenonia and the House of Altia were to join forces, there would be no one left in the kingdom capable of stopping them. Privacy settings. In other words, if things continue as they are, the two shadow forces could end up ruling the kingdom as if it were their own playground. As Alon pondered how the situation had reached this point, he suddenly recalled something he had said to Lady Zenonia a few months prior. Could it be? He wondered if the alliance, which should never have blossomed within the Kingdom of Asteria, had somehow come about because of something he said. But he quickly shook his head, dismissing the thought. Even if he didn't fully understand the character of Roria, the Duke of Altia, he knew Lady Kalia of the House of Zenonia all too well. She was the epitome of a villainess, the type who could not stand being on the same level as others or beneath anyone. She would stop at nothing, including committing the most brutal acts, to climb higher. With that thought, Alon felt a bit more at ease. Knowing Kalia's personality, the alliance was bound to be temporary. Evan? Yes. Bring me some stationery later. Stationery? Yes. Still knowing that nothing in life is 100% certain, Alon decided to take some precautionary measures. Speaking of which, Count, I looked into the rumors about Seol Ring you asked about earlier. It seems the rumors have been spreading recently. Really? At Evan's words, Alon turned his head. What kind of rumors? I heard that he's been very active recently in the colony. He's even earned the nickname Golden Flash. The Golden Flash. With a brief sense of familiarity with the name, Alon sighed in relief. Although he had always believed that Solrang would never die in obscurity, he had been worried, which is why he had included a note in his last letter to Utiayi asking about Solrang. I'm glad he's doing well. Indeed, in that place, if you gain enough fame as a fighter, you can be treated even better than a noble. If you're strong enough, you can even stand on equal footing with the king. With those brief thoughts, Alon accepted the stationery Evan handed him and spoke. Oh, and I'm planning to visit the tower in about a week. Privacy settings. The tower? Yes, it might take some time. It'll only be 2 weeks, right? At Evan's puzzled question, Alon shook his head. It'll probably take about a month. A month, as far as I know, the Green Tower is only about a week's journey from the Count's estate. I'm not going to the Green Tower. I'm going to the Blue Tower. If it's the Blue Tower, then it will take a while, but is there a particular reason to go there? The Blue Tower is located between Caliburn and the Labyrinth City, isn't it? As Evan said, the Blue Tower was much farther away, taking more than 3 weeks to reach. I have some business at the Blue Tower. Alon gave a brief answer and continued writing his letter, signaling that the conversation was over. Realizing this, Evan clicked his tongue in resignation and said, "Then I'll start preparing in advance." "Please do." With a light bow, Evan left the room. For a while, Alon wrote a letter to Lady Zenonia in silence. Once he finished sealing the letter, he let out a light sigh. It's going to be tough living in a carriage for 3 weeks just to reach the Blue Tower. Although Alon inwardly grumbled about how exhausting it would be, he was determined to go to the Blue Tower because there was something there he needed to obtain. "I have no choice but to do this for the sake of my magic." At the Blue Tower, there was an item that could assist with his half-baked talent, which only allowed him to properly study magic once a day. As Alon thought about this, he suddenly remembered the Labyrinth City next to the Blue Tower. Labyrinth City Lartania. In the heart of this city, fitting its name, there lies an endless labyrinth extending underground. It was one of the few places in Psychedelia where players could grind for experience and items without progressing the story. As the name suggests, the deeper one went into the labyrinth, the more experience and treasures they could obtain. However, no one who played Psychedelia ever reached the end of the labyrinth. Although it allowed players to level up without advancing the story, the game required players to return to the surface every 5 floors, which caused a day to pass in-game. Even though the story didn't progress, time still moved forward. If a player focused on exploring the labyrinth and neglected the story, they might one day emerge to find the world in chaos. Privacy settings. To avoid this outcome, players had to advance the story while exploring the labyrinth. Naturally, as players balanced both, they usually reached the 70th floor of the labyrinth before the game ended. Thus, no one ever reached the end of the labyrinth in Psychedelia. There was a rumor that someone using cheats had made it to the 150th floor, but there were more floors beyond that. As Alon recalled a vaguely remembered post from a community whose name he could barely remember, he switched his thoughts to Rhine. "I hope she's doing well." Alon had sent Rhine to Lartania not to make her a labyrinth explorer, but to train her as a magic appraiser. In Lartania, countless relics and artifacts were discovered daily in the labyrinth, making appraisers highly sought after. Magic appraisers, who could identify even the most detailed abilities of an item, were highly respected professionals. Moreover, by obtaining a certification as a magic appraiser in Lartania, one could live a prosperous life without worrying about money. That's why Alon had sent her there. Like the other 5 deadly sins, Rhine possessed a unique talent, the Library of Eternity, which was well suited for this role. "Well, with the gift I gave her, she should find appraising a bit easier," Alon mused with a slightly awkward expression. "Come to think of it, the gift I gave Rhine seems a bit small compared to what I gave the others." Unlike the gifts he had given to the other 5 deadly sins, Alon had only given Rhine an item specialized for equipment appraisals, which made him feel a bit embarrassed now. "If it turns out to be insufficient, I'll have to provide some additional support later." Accepting that there was nothing he could do about what had already passed, Alon shrugged his shoulders. It was a leisurely day. Labyrinth City, Lartania. In the southern district of this independent city, which had an overwhelmingly large number of explorers and mercenaries compared to other nations, there was an appraisal shop called Merd. The shop, run by a magic appraiser who concealed their identity, wasn't located in the best area. Even in a labyrinth city where appraisers were highly valued, the central area near the labyrinth was home to numerous appraisal shops. In other words, there wasn't much reason for people to visit Merd in the southern district. Yet despite this, a steady stream of customers visited the shop every day. Moreover, the types of customers were unique. Most were A-rank explorers who ventured deep into the labyrinth, and among Merd's customers were nobles from other countries and even the Lord of Lartania. "The appraisals are complete, my lord." "Oh, how is this relic?" "It's a device that continuously generates flames when infused with magic." The Lord of Lartania smiled broadly as he received the relic from the masked woman and glanced down, noticing the black eye emblem engraved at the bottom of the relic. Privacy settings. "Oh, could it be that this relic has the ability to be engraved?" "Yes." "How does the engraving affect its power?" "The efficiency has improved dramatically. Now, even with just a small amount of magic, the flames will last for an hour." "That's truly impressive. I'm always indebted to you." "Think nothing of it. With that, the masked woman gave a light response to the masked man's words. The Lord, with a delighted expression, vanished from sight as he left the room. Once the Lord had exited, leaving the office in silence, the woman, who was actually Ryan, removed her crescent moon-adorned mask with a sigh. She gazed out the window at the engraving the Lord now held in his hands. That very engraving was the reason why the shop Merd, despite being located in the Southern District, was earning more money than any other appraiser's shop. Ryan could do more than just appraise relics brought by high-ranking individuals. She could also engrave certain relics to further enhance their abilities. However, this was not Ryan's own ability. Her talent lay in using the library to accurately identify the nature of relics and determine which specific relics could be engraved. The ability to engrave was thanks to the gift from the Great Moon. As Ryan turned her gaze slightly and opened the door to the adjacent office, she entered a small room where a golden eye, surrounded by a blue halo, was operating. 48 to 500. Looking at the display floating above the halo, Ryan recalled the first time she had discovered this gift from the Great Moon. At first, Ryan, like the others, didn't understand why the Great Moon had sent her to the Labyrinth City and made her an appraiser. Although she suspected it was related to dealing with the Black Ones, given her knowledge of their forgotten existence, she still couldn't fully grasp the connection. At the very least, she knew from her library how powerful the Black Ones were, but she couldn't see how becoming an appraiser was related to fighting them. But after discovering the gift from the Great Moon, she had no choice but to change her thinking. The gift was the Eye of the Wanderer, an artifact capable of appraising relics that contained a certain level of magic. However, Ryan, with her library, instantly recognized that this eye was far from ordinary. Even though it initially appeared as nothing more than a simple sphere, Ryan unlocked the seals layered upon it, seals that even her library didn't recognize, and it revealed its true form, unlocking one specific ability. That ability was engraving. Engraving allowed her to inscribe certain relics from the upper echelons, thereby enhancing their abilities. Privacy settings. But ironically, the first thing the Eye of the Wanderer unlocked wasn't an ability per se. Rather than an ability, it was a means to offer sacrifices. With each engraving, the relic's power would increase, but Ryan knew that the golden eye absorbed something unknown in exchange for the engraving, something even she couldn't comprehend. She could sense that the eye was fundamentally changing each time this happened. My task is to awaken this eye. When Ryan realized this, she came to two conclusions. First, only she could awaken this eye. The eye only responded to relics with specific patterns from the upper echelons, and if she brought it a relic that didn't meet these criteria, the accumulated power would diminish. Second, the eye would eventually grant her enough power to stand against the Black Ones. Thus, Ryan followed the will of the Great Moon, watching as the eye gradually awakened with each relic it absorbed. Everything is to kill the Black Wolf. Muttering this to herself, Ryan gently caressed the golden eye floating in the air. And to follow his will, a faint, inexplicable fanaticism gleamed in Ryan's eyes. About 3 weeks later, as Elon had told Evan, he arrived at the Blue Tower by carriage. Originally, he had planned to meet the Tower Master as scheduled, but unfortunately the Tower Master was absent, so he had to meet with the Vice Master instead. But then, come on, hurry up and state your business. I'm busy. Faced with this curt and dismissive attitude, Elon wore a bewildered expression. Chapter 16. The status of a wizard on this continent has a rather peculiar structure. Like in many other fantasy worlds, wizards generally hold a high status. But when a wizard belongs to a tower, their rank eventually reaches the point where they hold a status comparable to that of nobility. This isn't just because of the difference in skill between wizards who are part of the tower and those who aren't, but fundamentally because of the tower itself. There are only mixed towers in this world, and they monopolize the production of various essential goods for the United Kingdom, including high-ranking nobles. In other words, the combination of a wizard's combat prowess and the exclusive production of necessary goods elevates the tower's power to the level of noble authority. Moreover, the authority of the Vice Tower Master, who can be considered the deputy master of such a tower, is said to pierce the heavens. Despite knowing all of this, isn't this treatment a bit much? Alon looked at the Vice Tower Master with a bemused expression, though his face remained impassive. She, draped in a blue cloak symbolic of the blue tower and with long blue hair cascading down to her waist, leaned her head on one hand as if bothered by everything in the world, while holding a pen in the other. Her name was Peña Crisineo. In Psychedelia, she appears once or twice in the main story as a wizard who, at the young age of 22, had reached the 7th rank, a ridiculous talent. Privacy settings. She was also a powerful wizard with an origin. However, at this point before the original story begins, she has not yet become the Tower Master and seems to be at the 6th rank rather than the 7th. As I mentioned before we met, I've come to talk about the Shimon. What about it? Alon continued, watching Peña wrestle with a stack of papers without even looking at him. I can get rid of the Shimon. At Alon's words, Peña's gaze suddenly shifted, her eyes hysterically staring at his face. There was a hint of curiosity in her expression, but soon after she made a blatantly disappointed face and clicked her tongue. Well, if you're done, you can leave. I haven't heard your answer. What answer? I said I could get rid of the Shimon. At Alon's words, Peña looked at him with a ridiculous smile. Excuse me, who are you again? Count Palacio, Alon. So our Count Palacio says he can get rid of the Shimon? Yes. Oh, I see, our Count Palacio can get rid of the Shimon, huh? Wait, why are you acting like this? Alon asked in response to her blatant sarcasm. Do you think you're the first person to say that? Do you think you're the only one who has come here, seeking the treasure you can get by eliminating the Shimon? Seeing Peña shake her head as if she were completely fed up, Alon spoke up. I'm not lying. If you guide me to the Shimon, I'll show you right away. How many people do you think have said that in front of me? I can definitely get rid of it. Alon's words made Peña suddenly drop the pen she had been holding and frown openly, releasing her magic power abruptly. This wasn't the implementation of a spell. It was merely a surge of magical energy. Privacy settings, the waveform, which was blatantly scattered based on her emotional state, instantly began to cause abnormalities within the office. The entire room trembled as if an earthquake had struck, and scrolls and parchments on the shelves fell to the ground in an instant. In the midst of all that, excuse me, it's starting to come to light that you only became in count because a bunch of trash conveniently died. And now you're desperate for a move to turn things around, but you shouldn't be causing trouble here, right? As Peña lowered her voice, filled with hysteria, Alon realized two things anew. The first was that, despite seeming to be consumed by work, she was surprisingly well informed about the outside world. In fact, just as she said, since becoming a count, he had lived quietly without interfering with the underworld, and rumors about him had started to spread. The other realization was that the anger that had surged within him, unable to tolerate the way she treated him earlier, had strangely subsided, as if it had been cured. She's terrifying, Alon thought, realizing that despite not having reached the 7th rank, Peña was clearly a superhuman who had transcended the realm of ordinary humans, as evidenced by the strange phenomena she created with just a scattering of magical energy. I shouldn't push my luck, or I'll end up snapped in half. Even though he was a 2nd-rank wizard, Alon fully understood that if Peña chose to use her magic, his life would be in danger. So he spoke. If you don't trust me, I'll stake my entire fortune. What? Despite feeling fear, Alon's expression remained as impassive as ever. I mean it. If I can't get rid of the Shimon, I'll donate my entire fortune to the Blue Tower. No, since this is a private deal, I'll hand it all over to you personally. What nonsense. Of course, you don't have to stake anything. I'll be the only one to do so, and I'm willing to swear an oath if necessary. Peña frowned at Alon's words, but he continued with the same impassive expression. This seems like a fairly good deal for you, considering you'd only be wasting a little time. What do you think? After a moment of silence, Peña responded. Write up a contract, Peña Crisineo, of privacy settings, a prodigy who reached the 6th rank at the mere age of 21 and the current Vice Tower Master of the Blue Tower, following her master, the Tower Master. She led Alon down to the underground, stopping in front of the door where the Shimon was kept. It's here. Once you open this door, the Shimon will be inside. Without hesitation, Alon moved his body to grab the door handle at her words. Remember, since we've already written up a contract, I won't go easy on you. If you fail, the entire fortune of the Palacio family will be mine. Got it? Despite Pinia's warning, Elon calmly turned his head to look at her. His emotionless eyes, revealing nothing, glanced at her as he spoke. There's no chance of that happening. Creak. With those words, he opened the door without hesitation and stepped inside. And as Pinia watched his retreating figure, she recalled the rumors about him. Once he was known as the hidden figure behind the Palacio family, who killed all the other heirs to become the Count. But over the past 3 years, his reputation had changed significantly. Now people thought it was all just a coincidence, that he was simply a lucky fool who became a Count because the other heirs died. Of course, some still believed he had reasons for not being active, but after meeting him in person, Pinaya thought the rumors leaned more toward the latter. Judging by his demeanor, he might look first-rate, but it's already over the moment he decided to close the Shimon looking like that. Penny was also aware that Alon's atmosphere was unusual. His inorganic eyes, a face so thoroughly devoid of emotion that it was hard to believe he was an ordinary human. For a moment, even she was silenced by his presence, but it was only an atmosphere. Having assessed his talent, Pinia couldn't help but laugh. He has talent, but it's only slightly better than most. His monocore is excessively small, and even at best, his rank is just at the edge of the second rank. He doesn't even possess the eyes, which are essential for reaching the 6th rank. The Count of Palacio astonishingly lacked any significant talent. He didn't have the eyes, a necessary trait for becoming a high-ranking wizard, nor did he have a vast amount of mana. His magical rank was only at the 2nd rank, and while his sensory perception was decent, that was all. Sensing ability, among the many talents a wizard must possess, doesn't rank particularly high. Privacy settings. In the end, the very fact that he came here confidently claiming he could eliminate the Shimon with such a mediocre talent only confirmed to Penny that the rumors about him leaned more towards the latter. She made a pitiful expression as she watched him, then turned her gaze to the rift in the center of the room, glowing with a purple light. The rift, which wizards refer to as the Shimon, time gate, is literally connected to some unknown subspace, making it an extremely troublesome phenomenon. Shimon, which appears primarily in places where magic is heavily used, causes considerable damage to its surroundings. For example, beings from another dimension might cross over through the rift, or it might suddenly absorb all the surrounding magical energy, creating a mana vacuum in the entire area. I heard they tried various methods to erase the Shimon in the early days because of this. As far as Pinia knew, no wizard had ever succeeded in erasing a Shimon. If research on Shimon had continued for a long time, there might have been a chance to find a way to eliminate it eventually. But for now, that method did not exist. In the first place, even if a Shimon appeared suddenly, it would naturally disappear after about 1 to 3 months, leaving behind a relic. Although the principle behind this was still not understood, wizards did not bother to spend time and resources researching methods that showed no promise. However, in the case of the Blue Tower, the Shimon that was expected to disappear in a few months had already been causing trouble in the tower's basement for over 2 years, without any sign of disappearing. Penia, lost in these thoughts, watched Alon, who had approached the Shimon without taking any action. Despite the passage of time, Alon remained motionless. Just as Penia clicked her tongue and was about to speak, Alon formed a hand seal. Penia was slightly intrigued as she watched him suddenly raise his hand to form the Wisdom Fist seal. Instead of using a staff as a medium, he used his own hand, employing a method that was considered primitive even in ancient magical texts. Methods rarely studied, even in academic circles. Just come out. However, Penia was only mildly curious. She had no intention of giving Alon any more time. She never imagined that someone using such an outdated method from a strange book could close the Shimon. Privacy settings. The moment he softly muttered something or just come out, Penia's irritated words stopped abruptly. No, not just her words. Everything stopped. Her half-open mouth, her furrowed, irritated eyes, her body, even her breathing. Everything stopped. And then she saw it. The thing that emerged before the Count. Greech. In front of Penia's focused gaze, something that was once purely black made an unpleasant sound as it opened its eyes. Upon realizing it, she saw that it was an eyeball with two red rings. It simply stared at her. If it had ended there, it would have been fine. Pinia's eyes, the talent she needed to advance beyond the sixth rank, instinctively discerned the essence of what was before her. She didn't know what it was, but she understood. This allowed Pinia to grasp one piece of information. That thing was a concept so simple, it could be encapsulated in a single word. It was K. The moment she began to realize it, Pinia forcefully halted her thoughts. Her magic, which had stopped even her breathing, moved instinctively to cut off her thoughts, because she knew. That thing in front of the Count was something she must never comprehend. Understanding it would be akin to drinking from a poisoned chalice that would inevitably lead to destruction. So, at the very moment she stopped thinking, barely remembering to breathe, privacy settings, the eyeball, which had been staring at her until now, smiled. Then, with a black hand that had formed at some point, it gently raised its index and middle fingers to her lips, an absolute command of silence. Understanding that this was Alon's demand, Pinia, filled with sudden fear, blinked her eyes, and as the eyeball disappeared, the magic ended. The place where the purple rift had disappeared was now calm, and Alon let out a small sigh. It's done. For Alon, who had closed the Shimon countless times in the game and knew how to do it, closing the Shimon wasn't particularly difficult. After all, Shimon wasn't closed with magic, but with a special, I swear I won't tell anyone. Well, I appreciate that, but there's no need to. I mean it. I swear I won't tell a soul. I'm actually very tight-lipped. Despite suddenly breathing heavily and even tearing up as she nodded fervently, speaking in formal language, Alon, why is she suddenly acting like this? Could only tilt his head in confusion. Chapter 17, Alon had already achieved all of his objectives at the Blue Tower. His goal was to obtain the artifact hidden in the underground chamber of the tower. And now that he had it, there was no reason for him to stay any longer. He decided to leave the Blue Tower immediately, partly because there was no reason to linger, but also because Pinia, who was already annoyed, might cause trouble if he stayed. Although he knew she wasn't an entirely irrational person, there was always a chance that something unexpected could happen. He thought this way just after he dealt with the artifact and let out a secret sigh of relief. But then, what is this? It's a potion I made. Alon glanced at her, forcing a smile despite his sharp gaze, and then picked up the potion bottle from the table. The liquid inside was a deep blue and it emitted a white glow when shaken slightly. This is a magic recovery potion, and a highly valuable one at that. In this world, magic potions don't work immediately like in other games. Instead, their effects appear gradually. Therefore, it would be more accurate to call them magic recovery enhancement potions rather than just magic recovery potions. However, among all the potions, the 5 bottles Pinia placed before Alon were the only ones here that truly lived up to the name Magic Recovery Potion. The highest grade potion he held could restore some magic power almost instantly just by drinking it. These potions, which were called Magic Recovery Potions but were actually Magic Recovery Enhancement Potions, were incredibly expensive. Alon had once tried to buy a magic potion when he felt inconvenienced by only being able to use magic once a day, but the price had almost made him faint. Privacy settings. I think the cost of these 2 bottles alone could buy a small villa. As he stared at the potion for a while, he turned his gaze to Pinia. Her awkward smile revealed a hint of nervousness, and as soon as he looked at her, she spoke. Do you like it? I understand it's a high-grade potion, but why are you showing this to me? I'm giving it to you. You're giving me this potion? Yes. A question mark appeared in Alon's mind. He could somewhat understand why her attitude had changed immediately after he closed the artifact. She might have felt a bit of gratitude or awe since the method to close the artifact was unknown until now. But to Alon, Pinia's current behavior didn't seem to stem from gratitude or awe at all. Does she misunderstand me like that wizard who came with Lady Zenonia last time? With this thought in mind, Alon spoke. Just to clarify, I'm a second-rank wizard. Yes, I know. Of course, you're a second-rank wizard. When he opened his mouth, suspecting that she might be mistaken, Penia nodded eagerly as if she had been waiting for him to say that, leaving him even more confused. Seeing her nod so earnestly, Alon couldn't help but wonder if she was just trying to flatter him. However, Penia's expression did not seem playful at all. In other words, it was clear that Penia wasn't mistaken about anything, which only made Alon even more confused. I swear I'll keep what I saw earlier a secret. Absolutely. Without a doubt, Penia continued. Alon replied, there's no need to make such a promise. No, please, make me promise. I want to promise. If necessary, I can even swear on my magic. I'll do it right here and now. Wait, hold. Before Alon could finish speaking, Penia quickly began gathering her magic power. The sudden surge of intense magic filled the office, making Alon's heart skip a beat. And before he could say anything, Penia had already sworn a magical oath. Is she really going this far just to keep the method for closing the artifact a secret? Sure, the artifact is a mystery to them at this point, but on the outside, Alon remained expressionless, but internally he was utterly bewildered. He realized that Penia was clearly misunderstanding something. You see, I'm good at keeping promises. I'll keep this secret, absolutely. Privacy settings. All right. Seeing Penia speak so desperately after making her oath, Alon could only nod calmly in response. There was no sign that her misunderstanding would clear up anytime soon. Thus, Alon left the Blue Tower with 5 bottles of magic recovery potion and the artifact he had sought. Riding in the carriage back to the Count's estate from the Blue Tower, Alon naturally glanced at the bracelet on his wrist. This bracelet, which he had received permission from Penia to take after closing the artifact, was the very item he had aimed to acquire on his trip to the Blue Tower. The bracelet of the impure. The design of the bracelet wasn't particularly refined. To compare it, it looked like a cheap bracelet that could be bought for less than 10,000 won at a local market. The only unique feature was the black gemstones embedded in it, which seemed to absorb all light. Other than that, it didn't have any remarkable appearance. But despite its plain and unimpressive look, the bracelet had the ability to compensate for Alon's small mana pool. Alon subtly rotated his wrist to examine the black gemstones. Although they were not visible at first glance, a faint blue energy could be seen rippling through the stones if one looked closely. The bracelet's ability was to absorb and store ambient magic, allowing the user to utilize it when needed. While the amount of magic the bracelet could store was limited, and not particularly large, it amusingly held more magic than Alon's own mana pool. For a brief moment, Alon experienced a strange sense of realization as he compared his own body's capacity to store magic with that of an item designed merely to assist wizards, like something out of psychedelia. But that feeling soon passed. Sigh. He took a deep breath, calming his thoughts. This is sufficient. I'm not going into battle after all. After all, the reason he sought out the insignia of the impure was to enhance his magical studies more efficiently and to protect himself in case of unforeseen danger. In this sense, the amount of magic provided by the insignia of the impure was more than enough. It wasn't an overwhelming surplus, but neither was it insufficient. Of course, having more is always better than having less. There seemed to be a technique among the artifacts to forcibly regulate power and reduce mana consumption. So I should study that, Alon thought, as he lightened his mood and concluded his musings. He then looked out of the carriage. As he gazed outside, he suddenly recalled Penia, who had bowed respectfully to him just before he got into the carriage. What on earth is going on? Privacy settings. Thinking about Penia's odd behavior that started right after he closed the artifact, Alon shrugged his shoulders. After all, he had no further business with her. He briefly watched the forest outside, bathed in the soft sunlight, swaying gently in a subtle green hue. It was a warm spring day. While Alon was on his way back to the Palacio Count's estate, 2 women were sitting across from each other in the office of the Duke of Altia's residence. One was Roria, the head of the Duke's household, who had completely absorbed the power of the Altia family and taken on the authority of the former Duke. The other was Kalia, the lady of the Zenonia Count's family, or more precisely, the de facto ruler of the Zenonia household. It's been a while, Kalia greeted. Indeed, Roria responded. The 2 exchanged casual greetings. Under normal circumstances, this would have been unthinkable. Roria had already inherited the noble title and was a duchess, while Kalia was still a countess and had not even officially taken over her family's title. However, despite this, Roria did not seem at all displeased by the lack of formal respect. The reason was that Roria knew Kalia held full control over the Zenonia household. Moreover, in the underworld, the name of the Zenonia Count was slightly more prominent than that of the Altea Duke. But above all, Roria allowed Kalia to speak informally because they both served the same person, the Palatio Count. In other words, they had no need to engage in a power struggle. Whether they liked it or not, they were both bound to forge an alliance under the orders of the Palatio Count, even if they didn't fully understand why. While they only realized that the phrase "meet the Altea Duke" meant forming an alliance after their conversation revealed they were both under the Palatio Count, they understood that determining the hierarchy beneath an absolute number one was meaningless. "So why did you come today? The meeting is next month, isn't it?" Roria asked. Kalia cautiously took out a letter from her pocket and placed it on the desk. "He sent a letter, so I came." "This?" "Yes," Kalia nodded. Roria picked up the letter and began reading its contents silently. The letter was far from a secretive document. It was an exceedingly ordinary letter. It contained a brief greeting, followed by discussions on noble families, with a few examples mentioned. It concluded with the remark, "There aren't many nobles who get along well with me." This was indeed a letter Elon had sent about a month ago, filled with somewhat reasonable explanations after feeling guilty for treating Kalia dismissively. The gist of Elon's message was, "I'm not just being difficult with you, I'm a bit curt with other nobles too. You weren't the only one." For an ordinary noble who received such treatment and then received this letter, they might have deduced Elon's true intentions as intended. However, Elon had overlooked three critical points. Privacy settings. First, the individuals reading this letter were influential figures in the underworld. Second, they viewed the Palatio Count as an undefeatable force. Third, because of the second point, they naturally assumed that this ordinary letter must contain some hidden command. And true to her sharp mind, Kalia began to piece together an impossible puzzle, as expected of a major player in the underworld. Kinia Baron is part of the aristocratic faction, and Marantino Marquis is one of the key figures in the royalist faction. Viscount Valanda is with the royalists, and likewise Duke Paldion is a prominent member of the aristocratic faction. As they began to classify the noble families that Elon had mentioned meeting and speaking with at the ball, it didn't take long before they started piecing together the puzzle. In summary, it seems he doesn't favor either the aristocratic or the royalist factions. For a brief moment, they both thought of the idea, does he want to kill them all? But they shook their heads in unison, as if they had agreed beforehand. It was too irrational. Naturally, the alternative that came to mind was, does he want to push out the existing nobles and create a new regime? After saying this, the two fell silent. Normally, this would be an impossible scenario. Changing an already established system isn't something that can be achieved by just a handful of nobles gathering together. But for these two, who breathe politics like air and constantly weighed the scales of power, the story was entirely different. It would require various preparations and time, but ultimately the answer they arrived at was, it's possible. Aha! Roria let out a low exclamation. To be honest, until now, she hadn't been able to guess what Alon was aiming for, nor did she understand why he had made her a duchess. But if this was truly his goal, then everything made sense. If he was indeed planning what she thought, then the notoriety of the Altea Duke was absolutely necessary. Moreover, if they allied with the Zenonia Count, the dominant force in the West, the scales of success would undoubtedly tip in their favor. It seems that must be the case, Roria said, shuddering as she realized the true intent behind the Count's actions. And so, late in the afternoon, as the sun set and the twilight descended, they began to draft their plans in a room where not even a magical lamp was lit. A strange puzzle had been pieced together and was now beginning to move on its own. At that very moment, Elon, in a forest where the early sunset brought a drop in temperature, he was eating a sweet potato. Tasty. Completely unaware of anything, his small remark as he took a bite of the sweet potato faded into the forest. Privacy settings, Chapter 18. It has been a month since Elon returned from the Blue Tower. Who, having acquired the insignia of the impure, Alon could now use magic 3 times a day, and by carefully managing his mana, he could even use it up to 4 times. Today he realized one of the new rules about phrases. Even if the same phrase doesn't overlap, using a similar phrase can produce an effect similar to overlapping. However, he hadn't yet fully figured out that to overlap phrases, certain specific phrases had to precede each spell. It seems to have something to do with arrangement. Alon pondered briefly. Your magic is getting stronger the more I look at it, my lord. But before Alon could fully address his thoughts, he was interrupted by Evan's voice, snapping him out of his reverie. Is that so? It's not just is that so. Look over there. Following Evan's words, Alon turned his gaze, and there in the middle of the training ground was a deep, wide depression in the ground. A second-tier spell shouldn't be this powerful, right? Well, you've always used spells that don't seem like second-tier spells, but there's a noticeable difference between now and a few months ago. Alon glanced at the sunken ground. Privacy settings. Indeed, for some reason, I've felt that my magic has been growing stronger. The spell Alon had been experimenting with was Gravity, a second-tier gravity-based spell. However, even gravity magic at the second-tier level shouldn't be powerful enough to crush a person or carve out the ground like that, even if the power is focused. In other words, it was impossible for gravity to create such a depression in the ground. It's not just an increase in proficiency. Of course, Alon had been diligently refining his magical abilities, and his mastery had been improving rapidly, but proficiency only improved accuracy and the ability to perform the spell, not the raw power of it. The increase in power from the phrases, well, that does exist, but it's not that either. For the past 4 months, Alon had been consistently using similar phrases in his spells, and for the last 2 weeks, he'd been using almost identical phrases in rotation. Alon had a reference to compare with, and when he did, he could tell his magic had been steadily growing stronger. It was subtle, but like a graph showing a gradual upward trend, his magic was improving little by little. It can't just be that I've become more familiar with the phrases and that's made them stronger, right? One of the conclusions Alon had reached after years of studying phrases was that they were closer to incantations than spells themselves. The more a phrase was recited, the more it served as a trigger to alter or add a special characteristic to a spell, not something that made the spell stronger through mastery. So, his increasing proficiency in the phrases couldn't explain the growing power of his magic. This led him to consider various possibilities. In this world, there are only 2 reasons why someone's power would suddenly increase, either through divine favor or by gaining compensation from a curse. I'll rule out the former. Even though he was a count, Alon was just a noble from a small kingdom, and at this point in time, he was even being subtly disregarded by the underworld. So receiving divine favor didn't seem plausible. So that leaves gaining compensation from a curse by suffering some kind of loss. At this thought, Alon's expression grew uneasy, but he quickly shook his head. In this world, gaining compensation from a curse meant either receiving a curse from someone who sacrifices themselves or placing a curse on oneself. Even the curse was a ritual used only in the East, and at that time, no one Alon was connected to had any ties to the East. In short, neither the former nor the latter applied to him. Alon repeatedly reminded himself of that. Thus, the conclusion he arrived at was, I guess I'm just in good condition today. Is that it? Privacy settings. That's it. There's no reason for my magic to get stronger. It was denial. I heard a letter from Utia arrive today. I should go and read it. With that, he decided to stop his magical research and headed to his office to read Utia's letter. The Holy Kingdom of Rosario. Unlike the Holy Empire of Bartiacan, which lies beyond the empire and worships the sun as its primary deity, Rosario venerates Saronia, the goddess symbolizing the moon and peace. In front of the convent, located to the east of its capital, the city known as the White City, due to all its buildings being pure white, stood a holy knight. His name was Roque, and he was clad in platinum armor, symbolizing purity, matching the city's namesake. Cautiously, he opened the door and stepped inside. Not long after, he saw a nun with white hair standing before the statue of Saronia outside the convent. Dressed in a neatly arranged habit with a gentle smile on her lips, She didn't seem to be of a particularly high rank. In Rosario, those of higher ranks always wore the sash of divine grace over their shoulders, but this nun did not. In other words, the nun standing in front of Roque was clearly of a lower rank than the Holy Knight. "Greetings, sister." However, upon seeing the nun, Roque immediately bowed and spoke. "Hello, Sir Roque, have you been well?" The nun smiled as she accepted the knight's greeting. It was an unusual situation, yet neither Roque nor the nun expressed any doubt about the situation. Instead, it seemed entirely natural to them. "Yes, thanks to you, sister, I was able to save 8 children and 25 lives in a small village to the east." "That's wonderful. It's all thanks to you, sister." "Not at all, it was you who saved them, Sir Roque." Her voice was soft, but Roque, maintaining a resolute expression as if determined to keep his conviction, spoke again. "Yes, I was the one who saved them, but it was you who showed me the way and gave me the strength when I had nothing." In truth, Roque had not always been a holy knight. Despite being a devout follower of Cyderonia and aspiring to become a holy knight, he couldn't wield the divine power that every holy knight was required to master. Privacy settings. In fact, he couldn't even sense it. As a result, while all of his peers mastered divine power and became holy knights, Roque remained a trainee for many years. That number stretched beyond 80 years, and just when he was about to give up on becoming a holy knight due to his inability to harness divine power, he met her. She, who always wore a serene smile, with eyes that seemed to burn like flames, was the first to say these words to the despairing Roque: "Believe in the moon." At first, Roque didn't understand what she meant. He couldn't see the difference between believing in Cyronia, the goddess of the moon, and simply believing in the moon. But at that time, Roque was desperate, and he held on to those words as though grasping at straws. He believed in the moon because, at that moment, he was beyond desperate. And after several days of continuous prayer, Roque, who had never once been able to harness divine power in the past 20 years, was able to use it for the first time that day, finally becoming a holy knight. Although Roque was overjoyed at suddenly being able to wield the divine power he thought he could never attain, his joy was short-lived as he began to doubt the nun. At least, for someone like Roque, who was born and raised in Rosario and had devoted his life to Cyronia, gaining the ability to use divine power was truly something to be happy about. But on the other hand, he began to wonder if he had strayed into the path of heresy. After all, the reason he had gained divine power was not because he had worshipped Cyronia, but because he had placed his faith in the moon. However, amusingly, as time passed, Roque's doubts gradually faded. The reason was simple. The divine power he had gained by believing in the moon was no different from the divine power that came from worshiping Cyronia. All the powers granted through faith in a deity worked exactly the same, without a single discrepancy. The sacred tools permitted under the name of the goddess also gleamed brilliantly in Roque's hands, further proving that his divine power was genuine. Even so, the lingering doubts in his heart persisted, and eventually Roque asked the nun why she had told him to believe in the moon. Her answer, however, had nothing to do with heresy, religion, or complex theology. Faith comes from invisible belief, but that takes too long. It's much easier for most people to find belief in something that they can see. That's why I suggested it. The goddess in the heavens may not always be visible, but the moon is always by our side. And after all, the goddess Cyronia is the moon. It was simply a story about faith. Privacy settings. It was a way for people who always carried doubts in their hearts to believe more firmly in the divine. With that answer, Roque erased the doubt from his heart, and he thanked the nun. He sincerely felt gratitude toward her for helping someone like him, who was full of doubts, to believe in the divine. If you'd like to express your gratitude, would you join us in prayer? It's almost time for the prayer session, and many others have already gathered. I would gladly do so. With a nod from Roque, the nun smiled softly and opened the door to the prayer room. Inside, many people were already seated. Believers, children, trainees, pilgrims, and holy knights. Each one assumed their own posture. Some stood still in place. Others sat in chairs. Some knelt on the ground, while others simply bowed their heads, hands clasped with those beside them. Yet, there was one thing they all had in common. Everyone in the prayer hall remained reverently still. Without making a sound, they simply bowed their heads and closed their eyes in prayer. And as the nun made her way through the rows of worshippers, reaching the front of the hall. Now then, with a gentle smile on her face, she spoke. Let us all pray. Utia Bludia, her crimson eyes faintly gleaming, spoke as she stood with her back to the moonlight streaming through the stained glass. To the great moon. Chapter 19. Officially, there are only 5 mages of the 8th tier, and one of them is Selim Mikarlo, the master of the Blue Tower. He had been on a business trip to the northern lands, home to the barbarians, for several months. Upon his return, he immediately sensed something was amiss at the Blue Tower. The first reason was the disappearance of the presence of Shimon, which he always felt upon returning to the tower. The second reason was his disciple Penia, who was also an 8th tier mage, blessed with a talent that could only be described as dazzlingly gifted. Penia, with her overwhelming talent, had developed an arrogant personality that reached the skies. Although she had shown at least minimal respect to her master Selim in the past, she had become increasingly impudent since she reached the 6th tier at a young age and was appointed as the deputy master of the tower. Her attitude toward him had become more brazen over time. In truth, Selim knew that Penia's behavior wasn't entirely due to disrespect for him. A significant reason was the overwhelming amount of paperwork she had to deal with while he was away on his frequent business trips. Nonetheless, even taking that into account, Penia had achieved too much for her age, and her arrogance had become excessive. However, Selim never intended to correct this behavior. While arrogance is a trait that a mage must be cautious of, especially in the pursuit of knowledge, Penia's arrogance did not extend to her research and studies. Besides, Selim believed that once she reached the 7th tier, her personality would naturally correct itself to some extent. No matter how talented and self-centered a mage might be, they would inevitably become humble upon reaching the 7th tier. At that level, one begins to realize how insignificant their past achievements truly are. And so, Selim had left her be. Until now. Privacy settings. You're telling me that Count Palacio came and sealed Shimon? Selim asked. Yes, Penia answered weakly. Selim stared at his disciple. Her usual fierce eyes, which never softened even in front of her master, were now filled with uncertainty. She spoke cautiously as if wary of something, a very unusual sight. The Count used the oath of magic to seal Shimon, so I can't talk about how it was done. That's right, Penia mumbled, her spirits dampened. Selim, noticing her unfamiliar demeanor, let out a sigh and thought about Count Palacio. Unfortunately, there wasn't much information about the Count in his mind. The Blue Tower was far from the kingdom of Asteria, so what little he knew came from rumors a few years ago. He had heard that the current Count Palacio had murdered all his brothers to claim the title. That was the extent of it. Yet, Selim couldn't help but feel increasingly curious about the Count. He knew that Penia wasn't one to easily bend her arrogance, and her talent only reinforced it. If someone managed to humble her, there was only one possible explanation. Magic that even Penia couldn't fully comprehend, or rather an origin-level spell. Selim smiled as he came to this conclusion. For the first time, he felt intrigued by this Count from a small, obscure kingdom. The next day, Alon checked a letter from Utia, which had become a familiar occurrence every month or two. As he read it, he thought, nothing special this time. As usual, Utia's letter contained mundane details of everyday life. It spoke of her life at the monastery and the recent activities of the 5 deadly sins. Alon, however, preferred these trivial stories over peculiar incidents. The fact that there wasn't anything particularly noteworthy meant that the 5 deadly sins were living quite well. Of course, it was a bit lonely that none of the others bothered to send even a single letter, but Alon understood. It's probably because I've never met them face to face. He had never visited the orphanage, so naturally he had never met the 5 deadly sins in person. Although he had provided substantial financial support, from their perspective, Alon was likely just seen as a kind benefactor. In fact, he figured they might not even think of him as a benefactor, but rather as just some nice guy from the past. Still, it didn't bother him much. His goal was never to win the affection of the 5 deadly sins. His primary aim was to guide them down the right path, ensuring that they wouldn't destroy the kingdoms. Since that goal had already been achieved, there was no need for regret. Even so, Alon couldn't help but feel a little sentimental. Despite his indifferent exterior, A faint smile of satisfaction crept across his face as he read Utia's letter. The others had never sent a letter from the very beginning, but Utia, despite living a nun's life, had consistently written to him once a month. It wasn't much, but the thought of it warmed Elon's heart. It felt like raising 5 children, only for all of them to forget his efforts and never send a single letter, except for the eldest daughter, who still remembered and appreciated his hard work. Privacy settings. Utia's the only one who truly gets it, he thought to himself. As Alon basked in this oddly sentimental, father-like feeling, there was a soft knock at the door. Knock, knock. Evan entered the room. What is it? Elon asked. Oh, I meant to tell you yesterday when I saw you at the training grounds. But it slipped my mind. Remember when you asked me to look into it last time? Yes, I remember. As Evan said, Alon had previously asked him to check with the Information Guild to see if the 5 deadly sins were doing well. Although Utia's letters used to give him a glimpse of what the others were up to, lately her letters contained fewer details about the rest. So did you find anything out? Yes, but there wasn't much need to consult the guild. A few of them are pretty infamous now, especially Deus and Sholrang. Alon motioned for him to continue, and Evan stepped fully into the room, organizing his thoughts before speaking. First about Sholrang, I've heard rumors that she's already become a warrior close to the rank of Baba Yaga. She's won 32 consecutive battles. 32 consecutive wins? Yes. That doesn't sound possible. Honestly, I didn't believe it at first either, but the rumors seem to be true. Among those 32 victories, only one fight went beyond 10 exchanges. The other Baba Yagas are getting quite nervous. That makes sense. Alon nodded in agreement, still stunned by what he was hearing. The title Baba Yaga was an honorable rank in the colony, and there were only 4 individuals who held that title at any given time. The title never increased in number. Therefore, if Sholrang managed to reach the record of 100 wins required to challenge for the title, one of the current 4 would have to face her. If I recall correctly, wasn't the Lion King the fighter with the most consecutive wins in colony so far? Yes, that's right. He had 41 wins, if I remember correctly, Evan confirmed. She's only 9 wins away from surpassing the Lion King. Exactly. Evan nodded as Alon pondered, momentarily imagining the Lion King, who joined as a companion in one of the games. It was then that Alon realized just how absurdly talented the 5 deadly sins were. The colony was home to not only common warriors, but also formidable ones. Despite being a military powerhouse that heavily relied on its fighters, even the surrounding kingdoms hesitated to pick a fight with them. Maintaining such a winning streak in a place like that was proof of her talent, and as Elon pondered this with a surprised expression, Evan continued speaking. Privacy settings. And there's a rumor about Deus as well. What's the rumor? They say that Deus and his order, the Eclipse, recently took down Kurga of the Snow Plains, one of the 8 barbarian chiefs. One of the 8 chiefs? Yes, one of them. You know who they are, right? The monstrous beings who have transcended into superhumans through their rituals, despite being mere barbarians. Even without Evan's explanation, Alon was already familiar with the 8 chiefs. More precisely, he knew just how absurdly powerful they were from the game. To acquire the special magical equipment needed to become a glass cannon in psychedelia, you had to fight the barbarians and defeat the god they worshipped. Just thinking about it makes me dizzy. For a moment, Alon felt lightheaded, recalling how it had been over 5 years since he encountered Ultultus in the game. Even now, just the thought of Ultultus made his stomach churn due to how powerful it was. According to the lore, if Ultultus were to awaken and ascend to a true god, it would gain power comparable to that of the 5 deadly sins. In other words, if Ultultus were to awaken in the north, the kingdoms would be completely overwhelmed, even without the involvement of the 5 deadly sins. However, Elon wasn't too concerned. Luckily, there's no chance of encountering it. As far as Elon knew, Ultultus didn't appear unless the 5 deadly sins descended. In the lore, Ultultus only appeared when the gods descended and shattered the laws of the world, merging with the 5 deadly sins. Unless a god descended and broke the laws of the world in a way that even Elon couldn't foresee, there was no reason for Ultultus to appear. Deus is doing quite well for himself then. It's not just that, successfully defeating a chief that even a master knight would struggle with has put him on par with the likes of Reinhardt, the sword master. Upon hearing this, Alon felt a slight pang of regret. Maybe I should have visited him at least 3 times a year. Thinking about how sweet it would have been to benefit from the connections with a master knight, Alon pushed aside his bittersweet thoughts and listened as Evan updated him on Rhine, who was now working as an appraiser in the Labyrinth City. The Black Imprint? Yes, Rhine's shop specializes in imprinting black marks that enhance relics' abilities. That's interesting. Intrigued by this ability, which he hadn't encountered in the game, Alon marveled for a moment before asking about the last remaining member. What about Ladon? In truth, Alon had asked Evan to investigate the 5 deadly sins mainly because of his curiosity about Ladon. Although Ladon had lagged behind Solrong, Alon had lost track of him about half a year ago when Utia's letters stopped mentioning him. Privacy settings. Of course, he wasn't too worried since he'd heard that Ladon had safely arrived in Raxus and was learning the ropes. But the fact that there had been no updates since then made him curious. However, I haven't found any concrete information on him yet. The Information Guild has some leads, but they asked for a bit more time, about a week, to verify whether the information is reliable. I see. Alon nodded, feeling a slight sense of curiosity, but he accepted Evan's explanation. 2 weeks later, while Alon was, as usual, researching relics in his office, he found himself debating whether or not to attend the Asteria social gathering, held every 3 years and attended by all the nobles. He was contemplating this while staring at the invitation when, Count! The door suddenly burst open without so much as a knock, and Evan rushed in. Alon was about to say something when, Ladon, it seems he's become a pirate. What? Alon's face froze at Evan's next words. Have you heard of the 7 Islands? Are you talking about the place where the 7 great pirates dwell near Raxus? Yes, apparently Ladon has become the captain of the largest of those islands, ruling over it entirely. Really? Yes. Hearing Evan's confirmation, a particular internet post flashed through Alon's mind, a post he had seen long ago about a child who, after receiving 8 years of consistent UNICEF donations, had gone on to become a Somali pirate. Alon, now frozen with the realization that Ladon had turned into a great pirate, felt like he could truly empathize with the writer of that post. Chapter 20. Just to be sure, what's the chance that the information is wrong? It seems there is none. Listening to Evan's words, Alon thought, why did Ladon suddenly become a pirate? The reason Alon sent Ladon to the port city of Raxus was partly due to his unique talent for tracking, but also because he belonged to the Sea God clan. In the game's setting, the Sea God clan was extremely rare, with only a few individuals on the entire continent. Although they looked similar to humans, their true identity was difficult to discern at first glance. However, Alon, who had played through the game multiple times and delved into the lore, knew that Ladon was part of this clan, which is why he recommended the treasure hunter profession to him. As a member of the Sea God clan, Ladon could breathe underwater, and with his tracking ability, Alon figured that if he could retrieve submerged relics, he would easily make money. On top of that, the nature of a treasure hunter meant that once you struck gold, you could live a comfortable life. So Alon even gifted Ladon a relic specialized for tracking. But now Ladon had become a pirate, not just any pirate, one of the great pirates of the 7 archipelagos. He's now a bigger figure than the Count of Palacio ever was. Privacy settings. Indeed, Indeed, Evan agreed. The pirates of the 7 archipelagos were technically more like lords ruling over their respective islands, each of which could be considered a small domain. Moreover, their naval combat prowess was so formidable that even the Empire, known for its military might, couldn't look down on them. The captains who ruled the archipelagos were superhumans, comparable to sword masters or the barbarian tribes, surpassing the limits of ordinary men. Even more concerning was that the current captains were said to be far stronger than their predecessors. As Alon considered all this, a question arose in his mind. How on earth did Ladon manage to kill one of these superhumans? Ladon's talents lay not in combat, so this mystery puzzled him. However, Alon soon arrived at a possible explanation. If Ladon had recovered some of the prime relics from the old era, it might make sense. There were many ancient relics hidden beneath the waters near Raxus, and some of them were extremely powerful. Alon himself had spent 3 days grinding through the treasure hunter minigame just to retrieve one of these relics from the Raxus seabed. Though he eventually grew tired of the minigame and never touched it again, the relic he obtained had been worth the effort. So if Ladon had used a powerful relic to defeat a captain and take their place, that would be somewhat understandable. Alon pressed his left hand against his eyes for a moment, but soon regained his composure. In truth, he had anticipated the possibility of something like this happening as he unleashed other sins into the world. He knew the world wasn't easy enough for everything to go exactly as planned. Still, it left a bitter taste in his mouth, and he let out a quiet sigh. It was summer. Beyond the Sea of Raxus, a vast maritime city, and the de facto heart of the Duchy of Korkia, lie 7 archipelagos. These 7 islands, known as the 7 archipelagos to the people, were originally ruled by the first pirate, now remembered as the Pirate King, Chaldean T. Braven. However, after Chaldean's untimely death due to heart disease, the 7 archipelagos were divided among 7 rulers, each ruling their own island, passing their reign down through the generations. This region has since become known as the Pirate Haven of the 7 archipelagos. Ladon, who killed the pirate Alcride Markney, the former captain of the largest island and holder of the title of the Slayer, granted by the Emperor's blessing through sacrifice, became the captain of the first island. Privacy settings. With a low sigh, Ladon looked down at the island. Despite being called a pirate town, the first island was quite well structured. Numerous houses were scattered across the ground, surrounded by cliffs that circled the massive island, and the homes built upon these cliffs made the island look like a giant fortress. However, what filled Ladon's mind wasn't the island's scenery, but thoughts of the Great Moon. What exactly is the Great Moon, he wondered. Ladon had never deeply thought about the Great Moon before, not because he held any deep loyalty to it, but because he simply had no particular interest in it. That didn't mean he wasn't grateful, though. He was fully aware of his circumstances. If not for the Great Moon, he would have been captured by the slave traders and subjected to biological experiments, leading to his inevitable death. Moreover, without the Great Moon, he wouldn't have met Utia, who helped him unlock his abilities and become what he is today. Still, despite all of this, Ladon felt only gratitude toward the Great Moon, and he obeyed his commands not out of loyalty, but rather because of Utia. For him, the phrase, "everything is for the Great Moon," was simply following Utia's orders. That's why, when the Great Moon first issued a direct command, Ladon felt resistant. Like the former Solrang, he too thought that going to Raxus had no real meaning. Ladon had too many targets for revenge. He needed revenge against the Black Ones who slaughtered his entire clan on an unknown, nameless island where they had lived in peace. He also needed revenge on the cursed hunter who, after he barely escaped the Black Ones and reached the continent, took advantage of his weakened state, killed his parents, and sold him into slavery. To Ladon, becoming a treasure hunter held no meaning, and the gifts from the Great Moon didn't seem to align with the vengeance he had sworn to enact. At least, until he learned that the captains of the 7 archipelagos were the ones who killed his parents. The reason Ladon realized this truth was simple. All of the current captains of the 7 archipelagos wielded the power of the Sea God clan. Though it was publicly known that they received the Emperor's blessing through sacrifice, the truth was that they offered parts of their own bodies in a sacred ritual to receive power from the Sea God Cloud, whom they worshipped. As soon as Ladon realized this, he raced madly to the center of Raxus's plaza. Privacy settings. There he found the old, torn, and now completely irrelevant wanted posters of the 7 archipelagos pirates. At that moment, Ladon was absolutely certain. The current captains of the 7 archipelagos were the very people who had killed his parents when he was a child. They had gained their power by using his parents' bodies. The moment he realized this, he felt an overwhelming surge of rage, joy, and confusion all at once. Even though Ladon had never shared his story after being rescued by the Blue Moon, it seemed as if the Great Moon had orchestrated everything from the very beginning. As if fulfilling a promise, he had given him the opportunity for revenge. However, just because the opportunity for revenge had come, it didn't mean it could be executed immediately. Objectively speaking, Ladon was currently no match for the captains who wielded the power of Cleod. Though he was strong, his strength wasn't enough to defeat those who had reached the realm of superhumans. As he began contemplating, it didn't take long for Ladon to realize that the answer lay in the gift bestowed upon him by the great moon. The gift, known as the Goggles of Amrita, had the ability to illuminate countless relics buried under the sea, making them easier to find. After discovering that some of these relics could compensate for his lack of power compared to the captains of the 7 archipelagos, Ladon realized that everything had been planned from the start. At the same time, he understood the true intention of the great moon: revenge and domination over the 7 archipelagos. The moment he understood this, the great moon became more than just a small entity he was grateful to. Not only had it laid out everything before Ladon, but he had also given him the strength to seek revenge. From start to finish, everything had been planned. For the great moon, Ladon muttered unconsciously. These words had once been meaningless to him, just a simple phrase without any real significance. But now, for the great moon no longer felt hollow. Now, when those words left his mouth, they carried true meaning. For the great moon. Only then did they hold the significance of loyalty. About 3 months had passed since the news of the 5th son becoming a Somali pirate had reached him. As the unbearably hot summer began to fade and the leaves in the forest started turning red, Alon boarded a carriage, privacy settings. He was on his way to the grand church held every 2 years at the Duke Rotegre's estate. I'd rather skip this if I could. While his body was moving in the carriage, Alon's mind was filled with reluctance. The shadowy reputation of the Count Palacio family had long since faded due to years of inactivity, but what replaced it was mockery, which bothered him. Nevertheless, the reason he went through with it was because all nobles of Asteria were bound by the rule to attend the grand church every 2 years. There was a strange rule that required attendance once every 2 cycles unless there was an exceptional reason not to. Thus, Alon found himself in the carriage on Oayi, his way to the grand church, soon to be joined by 2 other nobles. This was a planned arrangement, as mercenaries or bandits often targeted nobles during the grand church season, so traveling in larger groups was safer. As nobles, they had enough guards to avoid trouble, but even getting into a fight could cost valuable manpower, so they increased their numbers from the start to avoid any incidents. Through this understanding, Alon naturally traveled with 2 families from the east, and the day passed without any issues. The problem, however, came that night. Count Palacio, isn't it a bit much to have only 1 guard? Is it a financial issue? If you're short on funds, I could offer you some help. It seems you've inherited your title in a rush, and now your finances are in trouble. Alon stared in disbelief at the 2 nobles who had gone out of their way to openly mock him.